The distress signal had been repeating for 6 hours before I received my orders. 6 hours of the same broken transmission, the same panicked voices cutting in and out of static, the same coordinates burning on every screen aboard the ISS Unbroken Will. 6 hours, and Earth's diplomatic office had sent 43 messages to the Tsar sovereignty. 43 messages, asking for a ceasefire, asking for talks, asking for anything that might stop what was happening at Colony Station Helix 9. They sent back one reply. Your station failed to comply. Administrative correction is underway. Do not interfere. Administrative correction. That is what they called it, as if 12,000 human lives were a filing error that needed sorting. I am Commander Yara Vasquez, and when Admiral Crane handed me my sealed orders at 0300 hours and told me this mission did not exist, I already knew what I was going to find when I got there. I had read the intelligence files. I had studied the Tsar sovereignty's history for 2 years before this assignment. I knew exactly what administrative correction meant in their language. It meant they had decided to remove the problem entirely. My ship, the ISS Unbroken Will, dropped out of faster-than-light travel at exactly 0614 hours, local fleet time. The moment we arrived, Lieutenant Owen Price, my sensor officer, pulled up the tactical display and went quiet for 3 full seconds. That silence told me everything before he said a word. Commander, he said, and his voice was very controlled, the way people speak when they are trying not to let their feelings come through. I have 47 Tsar warships on screen. The station is partially gone. The lower ring is not there anymore. I looked at the display. He was right. The lower ring of Helix 9 housed the residential quarters, the school, the medical center, and the hydroponic farms that fed everyone who lived there. 4,211 people had called that ring home. How long ago? I asked. Based on the debris spread and thermal decay on the wreckage, approximately 14 hours. So it had started well before the distress signal ever reached Earth. The Tsar had not waited for a response to their demand. They had made the demand, set a timer that no one outside their command structure knew about, and when the timer ran out, they had simply done what they intended to do from the beginning. The remaining 8,000 people aboard the station's upper sections were alive. For now, I could see their power signatures, faint and irregular, running on emergency reserves. Some of them were transmitting. Personal comms, not the main broadcast system, because the main broadcast system had been taken out in the first salvo. Small voices reaching out into space from what remained of their home, hoping someone was listening. I was listening. Owen, I said, how many ships does Vrethok have in that formation? 47 confirmed. I'm getting intermittent reads on 3 more that might be running quiet on the far side of the debris field, so possibly 50. 50 warships. The Tsar battle fleet commanded by Admiral Vrethok, the same Vrethok who had subdued 6 independent star systems in the past 12 years. The same Vrethok whose name appeared in the files of every species in the Galactic Congress as a symbol of force that could not be reasoned with. Vrethok the Immovable, they called him, because once he committed to a position, nothing in the known galaxy had ever made him change it. I watched his fleet on my tactical screen for a long moment. They had formed a containment ring around the station. Not a defensive posture, not a patrol pattern. A containment ring, the kind you use when you intend to prevent something from leaving, or something from arriving. They knew help might come. They were ready for it. My comms officer, Corporal Nadia Lowe, turned in her chair and looked at me with the kind of expression that asks a question without words. She was 24 years old. She had been assigned to the Unbroken Will fresh out of the Fleet Communications Academy, and she was very good at her job. And right now, she was looking at 50 enemy warships on her screen and wondering what her commander was going to do. Nadia, I said, open a channel to the station. Survivor's frequency. She found it in 3 seconds. She was always fast. The sound that came through the speaker was not what I expected. I had expected fear. I had expected the desperate sound of people who had been under fire for hours and had watched their neighbors disappear into wreckage. And yes, there was fear in those voices. But there was something else too, something stubborn, something that sounded, even through the static and the damage and the 14 hours of horror they had lived through, like anger. A man's voice came through clearest, strong, rough at the edges, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent years working outside in hard conditions. "This is Station Administrator Cole Harrington. I have approximately 7,900 survivors in the upper sections. We have sealed the pressure breaches. We have medical teams working. We have 2 children in surgical crisis right now, and no way to get them proper care. If anyone is receiving this, please know that we are holding. We are not surrendering this station. I say again, we are not surrendering." I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second. Then I opened them. "Cole Harrington, this is Commander Yara Vasquez, aboard the ISS Unbroken Will. I am receiving you. We have arrived. Keep your people calm and away from the outer hull sections. Help is here." The silence that followed my transmission lasted 4 seconds. Then Cole Harrington's voice came back, and it was different now. Not weak, not broken, but the voice of a man who had been carrying an enormous weight alone for a very long time and had just felt someone reach out to help hold it. "Commander Vasquez," he said quietly, "I have never been happier to hear a stranger's voice in my entire life. I'm going to need you to stay off comms for a while," I told him. "What I'm about to do is going to require my full attention. Just keep your people safe. I'll be back on your channel when it's done." I cut the connection before he could respond, because I needed to focus, and because if I listened to his voice for too much longer, I was going to feel things that would interfere with the precision required for what came next. "Owen," I said, "give me a full tactical breakdown of the Tsar formation. I want their shield frequencies, their engine output signatures, their firing arc coverage, and any gaps in the containment ring. I want it all on screen in the next 4 minutes." "Yes, Commander." "Nadia, I want a direct channel ready to Admiral Vrethok's flagship. Do not open it yet. Just have it ready." "Ready, Commander." I stood up from my command chair, which I almost never do during active situations, because I find that standing helps me think in a way that sitting does not. I walked to the forward viewport. It was not a practical thing to do on a warship, looking out a physical window instead of relying on sensors. But sometimes the practical thing and the necessary thing are different. I looked at 50 Tsar warships, surrounding what was left of a home where 12,000 people had lived. 50 ships, against one. That was the part they did not understand yet, the part none of them understood. They looked at my ship on their sensors and saw one vessel. They calculated the ratio, 50 to 1, and they felt whatever the Tsar equivalent of confidence is. They had done this calculation before. They had done it in 6 different star systems, and in 6 different star systems, the answer had always come out the same way. They did not know what I knew. They did not know what was already in motion. "Owen," I said, still looking out the viewport, "where are our friends?" Owen understood immediately what I meant. His voice was quiet when he answered, because even here, even on our own bridge, old habits of secrecy hold. Ghost Squadron is in position. All 12 confirmed silent running. They went active on passive sensors 3 hours ago. They're ready. Good. I turned back from the viewport and walked to my chair. I sat down. I looked at the tactical display, at 50 enemy ships, and one of ours, and I felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment settle across my shoulders, like a familiar coat. "Nadia," I said, "open that channel." The channel opened. There was a burst of Tsar communication on the other end, quick and surprised, because they had detected us the moment we arrived, and they had been watching us sit here for the past several minutes, not attacking, not retreating, simply existing in their space, and that was not behavior they recognized. Species that arrived in the face of 50 warships either ran immediately or attacked immediately. We had done neither. A translator droid rendered the Tsar speech into flat, precise English. "Unidentified human vessel. You have entered a designated sovereignty operational zone. Withdraw immediately or face neutralization." I had prepared for this moment for a long time, not rehearsed, exactly, because you cannot rehearse something like this, but prepared. I knew what I was going to say. I knew how I was going to say it. I had thought about the words carefully, because words in moments like this are not just communication. They are the opening lines of a story that will be told for a very long time afterward. I leaned forward slightly. I kept my voice level and calm and completely quiet, the way a person speaks when they are certain of what they are saying. "This is Commander Yara Vasquez of the United Earth Navy warship, ISS, unbroken will. I am not withdrawing. I am not here to negotiate. I am here because 4,200 people who were living peacefully in that station are no longer alive, and the vessel that carried out that action is currently in this formation, and I intend to speak with the man who gave the order. Another burst of czar speech. The translator rendered it with its usual flat tone, but even through the flatness, something came through. Something that might, in a human voice, have sounded like irritation shading toward disbelief. You are one ship. You will withdraw or you will be neutralized. This is your final warning. I had known they would say something very much like that. I had prepared my answer for that too. I want Admiral Vrethok on this channel, I said. Not a communications officer. Not a fleet adjutant. Vrethok himself. Tell him a human commander wants to speak with him directly. Tell him that the human commander has something to say that he will want to hear before this situation proceeds any further. Silence on the channel. Not static, genuine silence, which meant someone was making a decision somewhere on the other end. I looked at Owen. He was watching his sensors with the careful stillness of a man tracking something important. Their formation is tightening, he said quietly. Inner ring is closing toward the station. Outer ring is turning toward us. They're preparing firing solutions. Are they at weapons ready? Not yet. Charging. Not ready. That meant they were thinking. Charging weapons was a statement, a show of intent. Firing them was a commitment. They had not committed yet, which meant Vrethok, or whoever was making the decision, had not yet decided that I was enough of a threat to warrant immediate action, which was exactly where I needed them to be. The channel crackled, and then a voice came through that was different from the first. Deeper, slower, carrying the particular weight of someone who had spent decades being obeyed without question. The translator rendered it in English, but even through translation, you could feel the character of it, the certainty, the complete absence of doubt that comes from a lifetime of winning. I am Vrethok. You are the commander of this vessel? I am, I said. You have arrived in a sovereignty operational zone with a single warship during an active administrative action. This tells me one of two things. Either your command has made a serious error in judgment about the tactical situation, or you are here to discuss terms of withdrawal for the remaining station population. He left a pause for me to confirm one or the other. I let the pause sit for a moment. I let it breathe, and then I said the 7 words I had been carrying in my chest since the moment I received my orders, and looked at the report detailing what had happened to 4,200 people who had been asleep in their beds when the bombardment began. You killed our people. We remember everything. The silence that followed those 7 words was the kind of silence I had never heard on a military communications channel before. It was not the silence of a channel malfunction or a dropped connection. It was the silence of somewhere between 30 and 50 warships, and everyone aboard them going completely still. I used that silence. Admiral Vrethok, I said, I am not here to discuss terms. I am not here to negotiate. I am here because humanity sent exactly what was required. And what I have to say to you is something every crew in your formation needs to hear. Before he could respond to that, I did something that no commander of a single warship has ever done in front of 50 enemy ships in the recorded history of space warfare. I cut the channel. I ended the transmission myself, before he could speak, before he could assert control of the conversation, before he could remind me of the tactical reality we were both sitting inside. I cut the channel, and then I turned to Owen, and I said, bring the Ghost Squadron to standby. Not active, not visible, just ready. Owen's hands moved across his console. Standby confirmed. Nadia, I want a full-spectrum broadcast ready. Every frequency the Tsar fleet monitors, every channel, every relay station in this sector. I want to be able to speak to every ship in that formation simultaneously. Can you do that? Nadia's fingers were already moving. 2 minutes, Commander. You have 90 seconds. She had it done in 83. She looked up at me with the expression of someone who had just accomplished something they were proud of and was trying to stay professional about it. I looked at the tactical display. Vrethok's fleet was still in formation, still charging, not firing. The inner ring had continued tightening around the station, and the outer ring was now fully oriented toward my ship. 50 targeting systems, all pointed at the unbroken will. I felt the weight of those targeting locks the way you feel cold air when a door opens, not with fear exactly, but with a complete, crystalline awareness of exactly where I was and what I was doing. "Owen," I said, "what is the current status of the station survivors?" "Power is holding. Medical teams are active. Station Administrator Harrington has organized the civilians into central shelter positions away from the outer hull. He's doing a good job up there." Cole Harrington, a man I had never met, keeping 8,000 people calm and alive in the ruins of their home, while 50 warships sat outside, and one human warship sat between them and whatever Vrethok decided to do next. "When this is over," I said, more to myself than to Owen, "I want to meet him." "I'll put it in the log," Owen said, which was not something a censor officer would typically say. But we had been working together for 2 years, and we had developed the kind of communication that does not always follow the manual. The tactical display changed. One of the Tsar outer ring ships had moved. Not toward me, not away, but sideways, repositioning. Then another, then 3 more. They were forming a tighter cordon. They were preparing for something specific. "Owen, are those ships moving to cut off our escape vector?" "Yes. They're closing the lane behind us. We're going to be boxed in within about 4 minutes if they continue." I nodded slowly. Of course they were. It was the tactically correct move. If Vrethok could not convince me to leave, and could not immediately neutralize me without understanding what he was dealing with, the next logical step was to remove my option to retreat, so that my only choices became surrender or engagement, on terms of his choosing. It was very good tactical thinking. It was also completely irrelevant to what I had actually come here to do. "Let them close it," I said. Owen turned and looked at me directly, which was not something he did often during an active situation. "Commander, if they complete that cordon, we have no FTL window." "I know." He held my gaze for a second. Then he turned back to his console. He understood, or he trusted. With Owen Price, after 2 years, I was never entirely certain which one it was, and I suspect it was both. Nadia said, "Full spectrum broadcast ready, Commander. You can speak to every ship in the formation simultaneously." Good. I straightened in my chair. I looked at the tactical display one more time. 50 ships, the broken station, the darkness of space beyond, the small signatures of 8,000 people waiting in the wreckage of their home. Then I opened the channel, and I spoke. Not to Vrethok, not to his fleet commanders or his gunnery officers, or his diplomatic liaisons. I spoke to every living being in that formation, every crew member on every ship, every person who had followed orders and arrived at these coordinates, and been part of what happened to the lower ring of Helix 9. I spoke to all of them. "My name is Commander Yara Vasquez. I am the commanding officer of the ISS Unbroken Will, United Earth Navy. I am speaking to every vessel currently deployed in this system. I want every crew member listening to understand 3 things clearly, before this situation moves any further." I paused for exactly 2 seconds. The first thing is this: 4,211 human beings were living in the lower ring of this station. They were farmers, teachers, doctors, engineers, and children. They were not armed. They were not a military threat. They had done nothing that justified what happened to them. What was done to them was not an administrative correction. It was a crime, and every person in this formation who participated in carrying out that crime should understand that humanity has their names. We have the command authorizations. We have the records. We remember everything, always, and we do not forget. The channel stayed open. No one interrupted. 50 ships, listening. The second thing is this: I have not come here alone. That was all I said about that. 6 words. And I let those 6 words sit in the silence of space and do whatever they were going to do inside the minds of every crew member listening. "The third thing," I said, "is for Admiral Vrethok directly." And here I stopped again, not for dramatic effect, not for theater, but because what I was about to say was the most important thing, and I wanted every syllable to land exactly right. "Admiral Vrethok, humanity does not bargain with people who do what you did. We do not negotiate for the safety of people you are currently threatening. We do not accept terms from someone who has already demonstrated that their word and their agreements mean nothing when they decide the moment is convenient to act otherwise. You sent 43 responses to our diplomatic office. Each one was a lie, and you were committing this action while our diplomats were reading them and believing them and trying to protect the people in this station through proper channels. I let that breathe for a moment. So no, there are no negotiations. There are no terms. There is only what happens next, and what happens next depends entirely on one decision that you are going to make in the next 60 seconds. Owen said quietly. 3 ships on the outer cordon have stopped moving. They're holding position. Good. They were listening very carefully. Admiral, I said, you have 60 seconds to order your entire fleet to stand down, withdraw to minimum safe distance, and open the approach corridors to this station so that our rescue vessels can reach the survivors. If you do that, this situation ends here. If you do not do that, then everything that follows is the result of a choice you made, and history will record it accordingly. I looked at the timer on my console. 60 seconds. I began to count. The 60 seconds passed. No one in Vrethok's fleet moved. Not a withdrawal, not a stand down, not a single ship adjusting its position toward anything that looked like compliance. The only movement on my tactical screen was the continued slow tightening of the outer cordon behind me, closing off the FTL window degree by degree, the way a hand closes into a fist. I had expected this. I want to be clear about that. I did not give Vrethok that 60-second ultimatum because I believed he would comply. I gave it because what came after needed to be understood by everyone, not just the command staff on 50 warships, but the historians, and the diplomats, and the Galactic Congress, and every species watching from the edges of this situation. That humanity had offered a way out, and the choice to refuse that way out had been made freely and deliberately by the person who bore responsibility for it. The record needed to be clean. Vrethok came on the channel again at 63 seconds. He did not wait until 60 had expired, which told me something. 3 seconds early meant he had been watching the clock and had made his decision before the time ran out. He had not used the 60 seconds to think. He had used them to position. Commander Vasquez, he said, and his voice was still that same deep, certain sound, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. Not quite anger, something harder than anger. Something that sounded like a man who had decided he was going to make an example. You are one ship. You are surrounded. Your rescue vessels, whatever you imagine you have waiting beyond this system, cannot reach this station before my fleet reduces it to the same state as its lower ring. This is reality. Accept it and withdraw, or become part of the wreckage. I picked up my stylus from the console beside my chair. It was something I did when I was thinking, just holding it, not writing, just having something in my hand, a habit from the academy. My instructor there, a retired fleet commander named Ida Grant, used to say that the best tactical decisions came not from the moment of action, but from the 3 seconds before it, when you were completely still and completely aware. I was in those 3 seconds. Owen, I said, target the lead ship in the outer cordon. The one that's been directing the closure pattern. Targeting. Nadia, keep the full spectrum channel open. Open, Commander. Engineering, I said, touching the internal comms panel. I need full power to weapons on my mark. Everything we have. Chief Engineer Philip Rourke's voice came back immediately. He was a man of few words and enormous competence, and his response was exactly 3 of those words. Ready on your mark. I set the stylus down. Mark, I said. What happened in the next 4 seconds changed the way every species in the known galaxy thought about humanity, and I want to try to describe it accurately, because I was there, and I watched it, and I still find it difficult to put into words the simple, complete totality of it. The ISS Unbroken Will was not the largest ship humanity had ever built. It was not the most heavily armored. It was not even the fastest. What it was, specifically and deliberately, and after 20 years of weapons development that had been conducted in facilities that did not appear on any public registry, was the most precisely lethal warship that had ever entered a combat situation in the known galaxy. The graviton lance fired. A graviton lance works by generating a focused point of intense gravitational force at a precise distance from the emitter, essentially creating a miniaturized gravitational event at a location of your choosing. At close range, the effect on a ship's hull is absolute. There is no material currently used in starship construction that can resist a direct graviton lance hit. There are no shields that can deflect it, because it does not operate on electromagnetic principles. It is not a beam. It is not a projectile. It is physics itself, deployed with surgical accuracy. The lead outer cordon ship, a Tsar heavy cruiser designated in our tactical database as a Class A suppression vessel, was struck by the graviton lance at its forward engine assembly. The ship did not explode in the dramatic fashion of entertainment programs. It folded. The forward third of the vessel compressed inward at the point of impact, structural integrity failing along every load-bearing axis simultaneously, and then the secondary systems, the ones that were never designed to handle the kind of physical stress that comes from a gravitational event at point-blank range, responded exactly as physics demanded they should. The ship came apart in 4 seconds. Owen said, very quietly, "Target destroyed." Across 50 ships, every communication channel I could monitor erupted simultaneously. Not with battle orders, not with tactical coordination, with something rawer than that, something that translated across species lines with perfect clarity, even through the flat voice of a translator droid. Shock. "Owen," I said, "identify the 3 ships that completed the cordon closure pattern most recently. Give me their positions, marked on your tactical display." "Philip," I said to engineering, "how are we doing on power?" "We can fire again in 90 seconds. We're warm. Lance is cycling." 90 seconds. In 90 seconds I could fire again. That was the limitation. The one real constraint on what the unbroken will could do. The graviton lance required 90 seconds between shots to rebuild charge. Everything else on the ship, the standard plasma cannon batteries, the rail systems, the defensive arrays, all of that was continuous. But the lance, which was the weapon that changed the equation entirely, needed 90 seconds. Vrethok knew this instantly. He was a fleet admiral. He understood weapons cycle times. He understood that whatever we had just fired had a recharge interval, and his response in the next 90 seconds was going to define whether he retained any tactical advantage at all. He made a decision. I do not fault him for it, tactically speaking. It was the correct decision, given his understanding of the situation. He ordered a full fleet charge. All 49 remaining ships began accelerating toward my position simultaneously. "Owen, give me the count." 49 contacts. Closing. Time to optimal weapons range for their plasma batteries, 40 seconds. 40 seconds until 50 ships could fire on me with everything they had, and I had 81 seconds left on the lance cycle. "Nadia," I said, "activate the Ghost Squadron. Authorization Vasquez 7 Bravo. Tell them the clock is running." Nadia's hands moved. "Authorization transmitted. Ghost Squadron is active. Here is the thing about 12 Ghost-class stealth frigates running silent in a combat zone. They are individually smaller than the Unbroken Will. They are less heavily armed. They do not carry graviton lance systems. What they carry instead is something that the Tsar, and in fact most of the galaxy, did not know humanity had developed. Synchronized fire coordination at the scale of a full squadron, operating as a single targeting network, sharing one fire control brain across 12 individual ships. The Ghost Squadron did not announce itself. It did not broadcast a warning. It did not perform any action that an outside observer might have interpreted as theater. 12 ships materialized out of nothing at 12 different positions within Vrethok's formation. Not outside the formation, not on the edges. Inside it. They had been there, inside the formation, running completely silent, for 3 hours. 3 hours of Tsar ships maneuvering around them, scanning past them, existing within meters of them, without any idea they were there. And then they were visible, and they were already firing. The synchronized fire network meant that all 12 ships selected targets in the same instant and engaged them in the same instant. It was not a staggered attack. It was a single moment, like a door being opened, in which 12 Tsar warships found themselves under simultaneous coordinated fire from vessels that had just appeared inside their defensive perimeter. Owen was calling out positions and status in the controlled, precise voice of a sensor officer doing exactly what he was trained to do. I was watching the tactical display and listening to him and tracking the lance cycle counter and watching Vrethok's formation for the moment when the response would come, because it would come. Vrethok was not a man who gave up. Everything I knew about him said that. 6 systems, 6 campaigns, never retreated, never surrendered, never changed course once committed. He was going to push through this. The question was how many ships he would have left when he got to the other side of it. The channel was still open. The full spectrum broadcast was still running. I had not closed it. Every crew member on every ship in that formation was still hearing everything that happened on my bridge, in real time. I had not done that by accident. "Philip," I said. "Lance ready?" 40 seconds, Commander. "Owen, give me Vrethok's flagship position. Bearing 274, distance 800 kilometers and closing. He's leading the charge personally." That was consistent with everything I knew about him. Of course he was leading it personally. "When the Lance is ready," I said, "I want a targeting solution on his flagship's forward weapons array. Not the ship, the array. Can we make that shot?" Owen turned and looked at me again with that direct look of his. "At 800 kilometers and closing, yes. Tight window, maybe 3 seconds where we have the geometry. But yes, we can make it." "Make it." "Yes, Commander." I looked at the tactical display. 14 Tsar ships were now in various states of damage or incapacitation from the Ghost Squadron's opening engagement. The formation had partially broken as individual ship commanders responded to threats inside their own lines, rather than maintaining the coordinated charge. It was exactly what happens when you introduce chaos into a plan that depends on coordination. But Vrethok's flagship was still coming. 32 ships still in the charge, some in better shape than others, all of them closing, and the channel was still open. "Admiral Vrethok," I said, with 50 ships charging at me, and 89 seconds having passed since we fired the first shot, and the Lance cycling up, and the Ghost Squadron engaging targets throughout his formation, and my voice as calm as if I were sitting at a desk on Earth drinking coffee. "I want you to pay very close attention to what I am about to do, and I want you to understand why I am choosing to do it this way." The Lance charged to full. "Owen, take the shot." The Graviton Lance fired for the second time, and the shot was the most precise piece of targeting work I have ever witnessed, before or since. The forward weapons array of Vrethok's flagship, a set of 6 heavy plasma batteries that represented the bulk of that ship's offensive capability, was struck dead center. The array was destroyed. The ship itself was intact. The hull was undamaged. The engines were running. The life support was fine. The 840 crew members aboard that ship were all alive and would remain so. But Vrethok's flagship could no longer fire a shot. The charge faltered. When the flagship's weapons went dark, when the formation's lead ship visibly took a hit, and its weapons signatures dropped to nothing, the 31 ships behind it did the instinctive thing. They looked to their commander for orders. And their commander's ship had just been surgically disarmed at a range of 740 meters, in a shot that no weapons system in the known galaxy should have been able to make. Vrethok was still alive. His ship was still moving. But he was, for the first time in a very long combat career, unarmed. I got on the channel. "Admiral," I said, "I told you humanity does not bargain with people who do what you did. That remains true. But I also want to demonstrate something to you and to every crew member listening on every ship in this formation. We did not come here to destroy you. We came here with a very specific purpose. That purpose was to protect 8,000 survivors and to make certain that no one in the known galaxy is uncertain about what humanity's response will be the next time someone does to our people what you did." I let that land. "Your flagship is intact. Your crew is alive. Your ship can still move. I have chosen not to destroy it, because I want you to carry a message back to the sovereignty. I want you to tell them what 1 human warship and 12 ghost frigates did to 50 of your best ships in under 3 minutes. And I want you to tell them why we stopped where we stopped." The tactical display showed me 31 ships, most of them no longer charging. Vrethok's formation had broken, not routed, not fleeing, but stopped, uncertain, waiting. "Because we could have ended every ship in this formation today," I said, "and we chose not to. We are not here to commit crimes. We are here because you committed one. There is a difference. I want every crew member listening to understand that difference clearly." Silence. Then Vrethok's voice came back, and I noticed something in it that I had not heard before. Something that was not quite uncertainty, but was no longer the complete, settled certainty of a man who had never encountered anything he could not handle. "What do you want, Commander?" he asked. It was the first honest question he had asked me since the channel opened. I leaned forward in my chair. I want your fleet to withdraw to minimum safe distance immediately. I want the approach corridors to this station opened fully. I want your medical teams to stand by to assist our rescue operations if their expertise is needed. Because there are children in surgical crisis up in that station right now, and every resource matters. And I want you, Admiral, to remain on this channel while I coordinate the evacuation, so that you can personally witness what happens when humanity shows up for its people. Another silence. Longer this time. Then, fleet, stand down, open the corridors. Owen looked at me. His expression was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. I was already opening the channel to Cole Harrington. Cole Harrington answered before the second ring cycle completed. I had the impression he had been sitting with his hand near the comm unit for hours. "Commander Vasquez," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had heard the explosions and seen the weapons fire on whatever exterior sensor feeds still worked on the station, and who had spent that entire time with 8,000 people looking to him, and who was running on something past exhaustion, somewhere in the territory that only becomes available to human beings when the stakes are high enough. "What's the situation?" "The situation," I said, "is that the corridors are open and rescue ships are inbound. I need you to prepare your people for evacuation. Priority 1 is your surgical cases. How are they?" "One child is stable, the other is critical. Our surgeon, Dr. Nina Aldridge, has been in that room for 6 hours. She's extraordinary, but she needs a proper facility. Rescue ship Meridian carries a full surgical suite. She's 18 minutes out. Have Dr. Aldridge standing by with her patient. Meridian's medical team will coordinate with her directly." "Understood." A pause. "Commander, I have to ask. I was watching on our external sensors. How many ships did you bring?" "Enough," I said. Another pause. Then, quietly, "Were you always going to win?" I thought about that question for a moment. It was a fair question. It was the kind of question that people ask when the fear starts to release, and they need to understand what they just lived through. "We were always going to protect you," I said. That much was certain. The details were something we worked out as we went. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell. "That is either very reassuring or very terrifying." "I imagine it's both," I said. "Start moving your surgical cases toward Bay 7. That's where Meridian will dock. I'll have my crew coordinate everything from here." "Yes, Commander." A pause. "Thank you." I did not answer that with words. I closed the channel and turned to the work of coordinating the evacuation of 8,000 people from a damaged station, while 50 Tsar warships sat at minimum safe distance, and watched, and while Vrethok remained on the channel, exactly as I had asked, silently observing. He said nothing for 40 minutes. Not a word. His ships held position. His crews stayed off the main channels. Somewhere on the other side of that open line, a fleet admiral with 30 years of victories and 6 conquered systems was sitting in a command chair on a flagship with no weapons, watching human rescue ships move through corridors that an hour ago had been surrounded by his guns, watching human medical teams run toward a station his bombardment had half destroyed, watching the organized, purposeful care that humanity brought to its own people in a crisis. I wondered what he was thinking. I still wonder sometimes. At the 41-minute mark, when Meridian had docked and Nina Aldridge's critical patient was in the surgical suite, and the other rescue ships were loading civilians into their bays, and the organized chaos of 8,000 people being moved safely from one place to another was well underway, Vrethok spoke. "Commander Vasquez," he said. "Admiral," I said. "I have been in command of fleet assets for 31 years, he said. "I have been in 94 engagement scenarios across 6 different conflict zones. I have fought every major species in this region of the galaxy at one time or another." He stopped for a moment. "I have never seen anything like what you did today." I was watching the rescue coordination on my screen, bay after bay filling up, ship after ship moving away from the station with people aboard, the count of confirmed evacuees climbing steadily. I found it more comforting to watch than I expected. "What part of it surprised you most?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. He seemed to be choosing carefully. "The precision," he said finally. "You destroyed one ship and disabled my flagship's weapons. You could have destroyed everything in this formation. Your tactical situation would have permitted it." Yes, I said. Why didn't you? I looked at the evacuation count. 6,400 confirmed aboard rescue ships. 1,700 still on the station, moving toward the bays in organized groups under Cole Harrington's coordination. 1,100 in the station's medical center, being triaged and prepared for transfer. Because the goal was never to destroy your fleet, Admiral, I said. The goal was to protect our people and to make certain that everyone in the known galaxy understands what protecting our people looks like when humanity commits to it. And killing my crews would not have served that goal? Killing your crews would have told every species watching this situation that humanity responds to violence with maximum force. Which is true, we do, when maximum force is required. But it also would have obscured the more important message. Which is... I watched the evacuation count tick upward. 6,500. That we know the difference between the person who needs to be stopped and the person who just needs to decide to stop. Most of the crew members on those ships out there are not Admiral Vrethok. Most of them are people who received orders and followed them, the way people do in military organizations. They did not choose this mission. They did not sign the authorization that ordered the bombardment of the lower ring. I paused. You did. The silence that followed was very long. You have my name, he said finally. It was not quite a question. We have your biometric authorization stamp on the bombardment order, I said. Yes, along with the orders of every other officer in your chain of command who approved it. We have the communications logs, the tactical records, the timestamps. We have everything. And what will you do with those? He asked. That is not my decision to make, I said honestly. My job today was to protect 8,000 people and to deliver a message. Both of those things are well in progress. What comes next is above my authority level. 6,700 evacuees. Commander Vasquez, Vrethok said, and something had shifted in his voice again, some further change that I could not name precisely, but recognized as significant. I would like to ask you something directly, and I would like you to answer me directly. Ask, I said. When you arrived here alone, before your hidden ships activated, before the first shot was fired, were you afraid? I thought about that. It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. Yes, I said. I was afraid, not of your ships, of what would happen if I made a mistake, of the 8,000 people in that station and what it would mean if I got something wrong. I looked at the evacuation count. Fear of failure is not the same as fear of the enemy, Admiral. I have never been particularly afraid of enemies. Another silence. Then, very quietly, almost as if he were saying it to himself rather than to me, Vrethok said something that I have thought about many times since that day. 31 years, he said, and I have never spoken to a commander who was afraid of failing their own people more than they were afraid of the opposing fleet. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. 7,000 evacuees, 1,000 left. The work continued. The last survivor came off the station 4 hours and 17 minutes after the corridors opened. She was 6 years old. Her name was Petra, and she had been separated from her mother in the chaos of the initial bombardment and had spent 14 hours hiding inside a sealed storage compartment in what used to be the station's supply level, which was technically still attached to the lower ring by a structural connector that had held by what the engineers later described as a margin of approximately 2% above failure tolerance. She had a small backpack with her. Inside the backpack was a change of clothes, a food packet, a handheld reader loaded with picture books, and a stuffed animal, shaped like a creature native to Earth's Amazon basin, that her mother had sent up in a care package 3 months earlier. The rescue team member who found her and carried her to the evacuation bay was a young man named Declan Ford, who was 22 years old and had been a rescue specialist for 8 months, and who, by his own account later, had been holding himself together by pure will for the entire 4-hour evacuation operation. When he found Petra in that storage compartment, and she looked up at him and said, in a very small but entirely composed voice, "Are you here to take me to my mom?" Declan Ford, by his own admission, had to spend approximately 30 seconds pretending to check his equipment before he was able to respond without his voice breaking. Her mother, Laura Fenn, had been in the evacuation bay since the first rescue ship docked. She had told every crew member she could find that her daughter was somewhere on the station, that she was 6 years old, that she had a stuffed animal in her backpack, that she was smart enough to hide and patient enough to wait. Laura Fenn had been right about all of it. I was not present for that reunion. I was on the bridge of the Unbroken Will, coordinating the final stages of the evacuation and managing the communications with Fleet Command, and watching Vrethok's ships hold position exactly as ordered. But Owen Price, who had been monitoring all internal comms as part of standard protocol, told me about it afterward. He told me that the sound that came through the bay audio pickup when Declan Ford walked in with Petra on his back and Laura Fenn saw her daughter was the kind of sound that makes everything else feel very simple and very clear. I believed him. By the time the last ship was clear of the station and the evacuation was confirmed complete, it was nearly 22 hours since I had first dropped out of FTL. My crew had been at battle stations for most of that time. Owen had not left his sensor console once. Nadia had been running communications continuously, coordinating everything from rescue ship approach vectors to the ongoing monitoring of Vrethok's fleet to the relay of information back to Fleet Command on Earth. Philip Rourke in engineering had kept the Unbroken Will operating at peak efficiency through conditions that the ship's design specs did not technically include, because design specs are written for normal situations, and this was not a normal situation. I was proud of every one of them. I want that noted. With the evacuation complete, I had one remaining piece of business before the ISS Unbroken Will could leave this system. I had promised Vrethok that he would remain on the channel while I coordinated the rescue. He had honored that. He was still there. I could hear the background sounds of his bridge, the quiet activity, the occasional Tsar voices that the translator droid converted into the background murmur of a ship's crew doing their jobs. "Admiral Vrethok," I said. "Commander," he replied. "The evacuation is complete. All 8,467 confirmed survivors are aboard rescue vessels. 23 of those survivors are in critical medical care. The rest are stable. No one else is aboard that station." A pause. "I acknowledge. I have one more thing to say to you, and to everyone still listening on the fleet-wide channel. I want you to relay this to Sovereignty High Command when you return." "I will relay whatever you say accurately," he said. "I give you my word." I considered whether his word meant anything, and I decided that in this specific context, yes, it probably did. A man who had spent 31 years building a reputation for absolute commitment to his stated positions was unlikely to compromise his integrity over a relay message, regardless of how the content of that message reflected on him. "The United Earth Navy carried out this operation with the following assets," I said, and I chose each word carefully, because this was the message that needed to travel. One Meridian-class warship, equipped with next-generation weapon systems, 12 Ghost-class stealth frigates. No other assets were deployed, no additional resources were required. I let that land. The Tsar Sovereignty arrived at this engagement with 50 warships. A fleet of that size represents a significant portion of your available military assets in this region. With 13 warships and 47 minutes of active engagement, the United Earth Navy protected 8,000 civilians, evacuated them safely, and neutralized your tactical advantage entirely. I paused. The Sovereignty should understand something clearly. What you experienced today was not a special operation. It was not an emergency response assembled in haste. The ships you encountered today are part of a fleet structure that humanity has been building, quietly, for 20 years. The weapons you experienced today have been in development, in facilities that your intelligence apparatus apparently was not aware of, for the better part of 2 decades. The tactical doctrines you experienced today have been refined through 100,000 simulations run specifically against Tsar fleet formations. I heard something on the channel that might have been a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the fleet. The translator droid did not capture it, but I heard it. "We have been watching," I said. "Not just watching the Sovereignty. Watching everyone. Every border incursion. Every unauthorized bombardment. Every administrative correction against a population too small to defend itself effectively. We have been watching, and we have been building, and we have been preparing, not because humanity wants to dominate this galaxy, but because humanity has spent 10,000 years of its own history learning a lesson that apparently needs to be communicated to the wider community." I stopped for a moment. Owen was watching me from his console. Nadia had stopped moving her hands and was simply listening. "The lesson," I said, "is that safety does not come from hoping that powerful entities will choose to be kind. It comes from making certain that the cost of choosing otherwise is clearly understood." I looked at the tactical display one last time. 37 Tsar ships, in various states of damage, sitting at minimum safe distance. Vrethok's flagship, fully intact except for its weapons array, positioned at the center of the formation the way a commander's ship always is. "We did not come to your space to begin a conflict, Admiral. We came to end one that you started. The distinction matters enormously. Remember it when you deliver my message." Vrethok was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "I will remember everything about today." "Good," I said. "Then we understand each other." I closed the channel. For a moment, the bridge was very quiet. Not the tense quiet of an active tactical situation, but the different kind of quiet that settles over a crew when something significant has concluded, and they are all, in their individual ways, trying to process what they have just been part of. Nadia spoke first. She was not speaking to me specifically, just to the bridge in general, the way you sometimes speak when a thought needs to be said out loud, but is not really directed at anyone. "Do you think he really will remember?" "Vrethok?" Owen said. "All of them," Nadia said. "Every crew member on every ship in that formation. Every person who watched this today, do you think they'll actually remember?" I was already looking at the message queue from Fleet Command. 17 new messages, all marked high priority, all tagged with the kind of classification codes that meant Admiral Crane herself had sent them. Most of them I already knew, would be about what I was going to report when I returned, what I had said on the fleet-wide channel, whether I had exceeded my authorized parameters, what the Galactic Congress was saying, what the sovereignty's official response was. A normal day of consequences, for an extraordinary day of action. "They'll remember," I said, "whether they want to or not." I turned to the navigation console. Lieutenant Felix Marsh had been holding our position and managing the ship's movement with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. Felix was the kind of navigator who never seemed particularly dramatic about what he did, who made precision look effortless even when it was not, which is the best kind of navigator to have. "Felix," I said, "set course for the fleet rendezvous point, standard speed." "Yes, Commander." "Course set." "Owen, one last check. Is there anything on sensors that I should know about before we leave?" Owen swept the display with the methodical attention of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and knew better than to answer quickly. "Vrethok's fleet is holding position. The rescue ships are on their outbound vector, all confirmed safe. I'm picking up 3 long-range sensor buoys that just went active on the edge of the system. Galactic Congress monitoring type. Someone's been watching." "Of course they have," I said. "And, Commander," Owen said, "there's a short-range signal coming from the station. Not a distress signal, just a continuous broadcast, looping." I frowned. "What is it?" "It's Cole Harrington. He's been broadcasting on the standard hailing frequency since about 20 minutes into the evacuation. It's just 2 words, repeating." "What words?" Owen looked at his screen. "Thank you." The bridge went quiet again. I thought about Cole Harrington sitting in the wreckage of his station, the place he had been responsible for, where 4,200 people had died before anyone could reach them, broadcasting 2 words into open space because there was nothing else left to say, and he needed to say something. "Nadia," I said, "please send Administrator Harrington my personal contact information. When he's aboard one of the rescue ships and has had some sleep and something to eat, and time to breathe, tell him I would like to speak with him." "Yes, Commander." "And tell him the signal reached us." I looked at the forward display as the unbroken will began to move. The station was behind us now, the debris field from the lower ring still spreading slowly in the mathematics of momentum. The Tsar fleet was behind us, holding position, watching us leave. The rescue ships were ahead of us, a small convoy carrying 8,000 people away from the hardest day of their lives. I thought about what Vrethok had said. 31 years, and I have never spoken to a commander who was afraid of failing their own people more than they were afraid of the opposing fleet. I thought about why that had surprised him, and I thought about what it meant that it had. There is something that people outside the military sometimes misunderstand about people inside it. They assume that the willingness to put yourself between danger and the people you are responsible for protecting comes from being less afraid, from being wired differently, from some special quality that makes the calculation of risk feel smaller to certain people than it does to others. That is not how it works. That is not how it has ever worked, in any conflict, on any world, in any era of human history. It works because the fear of the wrong outcome, of the people you are responsible for not coming home, is larger than the fear of the personal risk. It is not the absence of fear. It is a different kind of fear, pointed in a different direction, and it makes you capable of things that would otherwise be impossible. Vrethok had spent 31 years being afraid of losing, of failing in his mission, of the political and personal consequences of defeat. That is a real and legitimate kind of fear, and I do not diminish it. But it is a fear pointed at yourself, and fear pointed at yourself will only take you so far. I had been afraid, back there, of something much larger and much further outside myself, and that fear had been the most useful thing I carried into that system. "Commander," Felix said, "we are clear of the system, ready to go to FTL on your order." I looked at the screen one more time. The station, diminishing, the fleet, watching, the rescue ships, heading home. "Engage," I said. The stars shifted, and we were gone. The debriefing took 9 days. 9 days is a long time to sit in rooms and answer questions, but I understood why the process was thorough. What had happened at Helix 9 was not a small event. It was not a border skirmish, or a diplomatic incident, or even a standard military engagement. It was the first time humanity had openly deployed its real capabilities in a direct confrontation with a major galactic power, and the reverberations of that were going to travel outward through the political and strategic landscape of the known galaxy for a very long time. Admiral Crane ran the first 3 days of the debriefing personally. She was a tall woman, Eleanor Crane. With gray hair she kept short, and an absolute gift for asking questions that sounded mild, and turned out to be very precise instruments for extracting exactly the information she was after. She had been in command of Earth's Strategic Planning Division for 9 years, which meant she was one of the architects of everything I had used at Helix 9, the Ghost Squadron Doctrine, the Graviton Lance Program, the Synchronized Fire Network, the long-term intelligence gathering on Tsar fleet formations. She had built the tools and she wanted to know, in exceptional detail, how the tools had performed. I told her everything. The part she found most interesting was not the weapons performance. She had sensor data for that. It was not the tactical decisions, which she said, with the kind of brief professional approval that was as expansive as she ever got, were within acceptable parameters for the circumstances. It was not even the fleet-wide broadcast, which she reviewed twice and said was, and I quote her exactly here, exactly as much as needed, and not one word more. What she found most interesting was the 41 minutes of silence from Vrethok. "Walk me through what you observed," she said, on the second day, leaning forward with both hands flat on the table, in the way she had when something genuinely engaged her attention. "Not what you inferred, what you directly observed." I told her about the open channel, about keeping it running throughout the evacuation, about the specific decision to let Vrethok hear the operational communications of the rescue effort in real time, about what his silence during those 41 minutes felt like from my end of the channel. "And your read on him," she said, at the end of the call, the statement he made about 31 years. "He was recalibrating," I said. "Not his tactical position, his fundamental understanding of what he had encountered." "Explain that." "Vrethok has a career built on the premise that military superiority is the primary language of power in this part of the galaxy. He arrived at Helix 9 with 50 ships, because 50 ships, in his experience, and in the experience of every other species he had dealt with, was a number that ended conversations before they started. It was the language of finality." I paused. "We arrived with 13 ships, and rewrote the vocabulary." Crane watched me steadily. "But that is not the part that recalibrated him most deeply," I continued. "The part that recalibrated him was the evacuation. Watching us spend 4 hours organizing the rescue of people he had been using as leverage. The efficiency of it, the care, the fact that we were tracking individual survivors and sending specific medical resources for specific patients and coordinating 8,000 people with the same level of operational precision we had used 40 minutes earlier to disable his fleet. It told him something about us that the weapon's performance alone could not. Which is? That we are not good at one thing, I said. We are not a species that is good at fighting and bad at everything else, or good at diplomacy and bad at confrontation. We are equally serious about all of it. When we fight with complete commitment and extensive preparation. When we rescue with complete commitment and extensive preparation. He was watching a version of humanity that he had not expected to exist. He thought we were a young species still finding our way. He found out we had been finding our way for 10,000 years, and we were very far along. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think he'll advocate for de-escalation when he returns to the sovereignty?" It was a genuinely interesting question. I thought about it carefully before I answered. "I think he'll advocate for accurate information," I said finally. Vrethok is not a man who makes emotional decisions. He makes tactical ones. The information he carries back to the sovereignty is that confronting humanity directly, even with overwhelming numerical superiority, does not produce the outcomes they expect. Whether that translates to de-escalation or to a different kind of escalation, one that tries to compensate for the technological gap through other means, I cannot say. Crane nodded slowly. "That's the right answer," she said, which was the closest she came to a compliment, in my experience. "It's also the answer that keeps me working 16-hour days." The broader debriefing, the one that included strategic analysts and communications specialists, and a very quiet man from Earth's intelligence division, who never introduced himself, but asked very good questions about the timing of my specific statements, focused substantially on the fleet-wide broadcast and what it had accomplished. What it had accomplished, according to the analysis produced in the days immediately following the engagement, was this. The content of the broadcast had been relayed to every Tsar vessel's crew log, and crew logs were automatically transmitted to Sovereignty Fleet Command upon return to base, which meant that within 4 days of the engagement, Sovereignty High Command had received a verbatim transcript of everything I had said on that channel, along with the full tactical records of what had happened. Additionally, the 3 Galactic Congress monitoring buoys that Owen had detected on the edge of the system had recorded everything. The Congress's monitoring network, which exists to track military engagements in disputed and neutral space, had a complete record of the entire event, from the moment the Unbroken Will dropped out of FTL to the moment we engaged our drive and left. That record was automatically distributed to every member species of the Galactic Congress within 6 hours of our departure, which meant that by the time I was sitting in my second day of debriefing with Admiral Crane, approximately 73 species had received and were reviewing a comprehensive account of what 1 human warship and 12 ghost frigates had done to 50 Tsar vessels in a 47-minute engagement. The communication traffic that resulted from that distribution was, according to the Intelligence Division, unprecedented in volume and tone. The quiet man without a name mentioned this on the 3rd day of the debriefing, in the specific context of asking me whether I had anticipated the galactic response when I made the fleet-wide broadcast. Not the specific response, I said honestly. I anticipated that the Congress monitoring buoys would record everything. I anticipated that the record would be distributed. I anticipated that what we showed and said at Helix 9 would travel further than just the Tsar sovereignty. Was that a goal? He asked. I considered the question carefully, because it was the kind of question that had implications beyond the straightforward answer. My primary goal was the safety of the survivors, I said. My secondary goal was the delivery of a clear message to the Tsar sovereignty. Whether the message traveled further was a consequence of the method, not a separate objective I planned for. He wrote something in his notes. I do not know what. He did not share his notes with anyone I had access to. On the 4th day, I was given 48 hours of rest. I spent most of it sleeping, which is what happens when you have been operating on adrenaline and purpose for long enough, and the structure that was holding you upright finally steps back and lets your body have an honest accounting of what the previous week had cost it. On the 6th day, I received a message from Cole Harrington. He had written it, not recorded it, which I found interesting. People who choose to write, rather than record their communications, are generally people who want to think carefully about what they are saying and have the time to revise it before it is sent. The message was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph thanked me for what the crew of the Unbroken Will had done, in terms that were specific and detailed rather than general. which I respected. He mentioned Declan Ford by name. He mentioned Dr. Aldridge. He mentioned Owen Price's voice on the evacuation coordination channel, which he described as the most calming sound he had heard in the worst 20 hours of his life. He was specific. He remembered everyone. The second paragraph was about the 4,200. He wrote about them the way a person writes about people they knew individually, not as a number, not as a casualty figure, but as specific human beings, with specific names, and specific things they had contributed to the life of the station. He wrote about the head farmer in the lower rings hydroponic section, a man named George Albright, who had developed 3 new growing techniques specifically adapted to the station's artificial gravity environment. He wrote about a school teacher named Priya Carver, who had been, by every account, the kind of teacher whose students remembered her their entire lives. He wrote about children. He wrote about them without sentimentality and without distance, the way you write about someone you miss. The third paragraph was a question. It was a simple question, and it was the kind of question that stays with you. Commander Vasquez, he wrote, I have been trying to understand what made it possible for you to arrive at that station the way you did. Not technically. I mean, I understand that humanity has been preparing for a situation like this. I mean, what made it possible inside you? What do you carry that allowed you to park one ship in front of 50 and speak the way you spoke? I ask because I have 8,000 people who survived because of what you did, and many of them are asking questions I do not know how to answer, about what this means, about whether we are safe now, about what kind of universe we are living in. I feel that if I understood what you carry, I might be able to answer them better. I read that paragraph several times. Then I wrote back. Administrator Harrington, I wrote, what I carry is not special. Every person who has ever stood between danger and the people they are responsible for carries the same thing. It is the understanding that the people behind you are worth more than the risk in front of you. That understanding does not make you fearless. It makes you willing to be afraid and move forward anyway. I paused. Tell your 8,000 people that they are safe, because humanity decided they were worth protecting. Tell them that decision was made before any of us knew their names, when someone built the ships, and wrote the doctrines, and trained the crews. Tell them that they are not alone in this galaxy, and that we will not leave them alone. I sent it. Then I sat quietly in my quarters for a while, with nothing specific to think about, which is a rare and valuable condition for a person in my line of work. On the 9th day, the debriefing concluded. Admiral Crane gave me 2 weeks of leave and then a new set of sealed orders. The orders said the mission they contained did not exist. I had heard that before. I read them anyway. The Galactic Congress requested my presence 3 weeks after the engagement at Helix 9. Not Earth's delegation, not through Ambassador Delacroix, not through any of the formal channels that diplomatic requests normally travel. A direct request, addressed to me personally, stamped with the full authority of the Congress Presiding Council, which was a body that had not addressed a non-ambassador individual directly in 11 years, and had never, to anyone's knowledge, addressed a military commander below the rank of admiral. Crane called me into her office to discuss it before I had finished reading the request. "They want you in the chamber," she said, not looking up from her desk immediately when I entered. She finished what she was writing first, which was her habit, finishing one thing before starting another, a discipline I had always found quietly instructive. Then she looked up. "You," specifically. The request names you, your rank, and the exact date of the engagement. "Why me and not you?" I asked. "Because I wasn't in that chamber," she said. "You were." She set down her pen. "They want the person who spoke those words on that channel. They want to look at her. What do you want me to say to them?" Crane considered that question with the same seriousness she brought to tactical assessments. "What they need to hear," she said finally, "which may not be the same thing as what they want to hear, and which is entirely within your judgment to determine." That was more latitude than I expected. I said so. "You've earned it," she said, which was the most expansive thing she had ever said to me, and she said it with the same flat calm she used for everything, and it hit me differently because of that. She picked up her pen again. "The request allows you one staff member. Take Owen Price. He's been monitoring the Congress's communication traffic since the engagement, and his situational briefings have been the clearest I've received. Owen reads the political landscape like he reads a sensor display," I agreed. "Yes," Crane said. which is unusual and useful. Go. Owen and I traveled to the Congress station aboard a diplomatic shuttle, which was a different experience from traveling aboard the Unbroken Will, in roughly the same way that riding a bicycle is a different experience from flying a jet aircraft. The shuttle was comfortable, quiet, and moved at a pace that felt faintly embarrassing to anyone accustomed to military FTL. Owen spent most of the journey reviewing his communications analysis on a portable display. I spent most of it thinking. The Galactic Congress Station was the largest artificial structure in the known galaxy. I had seen images of it, obviously, but images do not prepare you for the scale of something built to accommodate representatives of over 200 sapient species, each with their own atmospheric requirements, gravitational preferences, sensory ranges, and cultural protocols. The station was, in effect, a city in space, organized around a central chamber large enough to hold the delegations of every member species simultaneously, with supporting sections that extended outward like the arms of an enormous wheel. We were met at the docking port by Ambassador Delacroix's aide, a young woman named Sophia Okafor who was efficient, calm, and gave the impression of someone who had navigated a great many complicated situations with minimal drama. She handed me a briefing packet as we walked, and summarized it simultaneously, which was an impressive piece of multitasking. The presiding council has allocated 40 minutes of chamber time, she said. Standard protocol is an opening statement of no more than 5 minutes, followed by questions from member delegations in order of seniority. There are currently 207 member delegations who have submitted questions for your session. Given the 40-minute allocation and standard questioning pace, you will have time to address approximately 12 to 15 questions. 207 delegations submitted questions, Owen said. Yes. In 3 weeks, he said. Yes. He glanced at me. I looked straight ahead. How did Ambassador Delacroix's team select which 12 to 15 we would address? I asked. The ambassador reviewed all submissions personally, Sophia said. He has organized them into thematic clusters. You'll have representatives from each of the major thematic areas. She paused, then added in a slightly different register, the register people use when they are saying something they consider important. He wants you to know that the most significant cluster, in terms of the number of delegations that submitted essentially the same question in different forms, is questions about intention. What we intend going forward, I said. Yes. Specifically, whether the capabilities demonstrated at Helix 9 represent a shift in Earth's strategic posture that other species should interpret as a threat to their own security. I had expected this. I had prepared for it. But hearing it described as the largest single category of question, from 207 delegations who were all apparently asking different versions of the same thing, made it feel more concrete. How many of those delegations are genuinely asking out of concern about their own safety? I said, more to Owen than to Sophia. Owen answered without looking up from his display. Based on the communication traffic I've been monitoring, about 30% are genuinely uncertain and concerned. The remaining 70% already know the answer to the question. They're asking it on the record because they want humanity's capabilities and intentions officially documented in the Congress proceedings, so they can reference it later, I said. Yes, some as reassurance, some as justification for whatever they plan to do in response to what happened at Helix 9. Sophia Okafor said nothing to that, but the slight alteration of her expression told me she was both listening and agreeing with Owen's read. We arrived at the Congress chamber with 12 minutes to spare. The chamber was everything the images suggested and a great deal more. I had been prepared for scale. I had not been fully prepared for the sound of it, the ambient noise of 200 delegations in close proximity, the translation systems running constantly in the background, the movement and breath and small communications of what amounted to a significant portion of sapient life in this region of the galaxy, all gathered in one room and collectively focused, to a degree that was nearly physical, on the 2 human beings who had just walked in through the lower delegation entrance. Ambassador Delacroix met us at the floor entrance. He was a tall man, older than his official profile photos suggested, with the kind of face that has learned to express exactly what it intends to express, and nothing more. He shook my hand firmly. His eyes were clear and very alert. Commander Vasquez, he said, I have spent the last 3 weeks explaining to this body what you said and did and why. They are ready to hear it from you directly. He glanced at Owen. "Lieutenant Price, your traffic analysis has been invaluable." "Glad it helped, Ambassador," Owen said. Delacroix looked at me again. "Are you ready?" I thought about what Crane had said. What they need to hear, which may not be the same as what they want to hear. "Yes," I said. The chamber quietened as we walked to the central floor position. The presiding council occupied the elevated tier at the far end of the chamber. The senior council member, a representative of the Velhari species whose diplomatic record stretched back nearly 2 centuries, and who had, according to Delacroix's briefing, personally overseen the admission of 47 new species to the Congress, looked down at me with the particular kind of attention that belongs to someone who has seen a great many things and is trying to accurately categorize this new one. I did not use notes. I had prepared what I was going to say carefully enough that I did not need them. "My name is Yara Vasquez," I said, into the silence of 200 delegations and the translation systems carrying my words into 187 languages simultaneously. "I am a commander in the United Earth Navy. 3 weeks ago, I commanded the engagement at Colony Station Helix 9 in the Outer Sovereignty Border Zone. I have been asked to appear before this body to explain what happened and why." I looked around the chamber slowly, not performing confidence, just taking in the room the way you take in a tactical environment, with open attention and full awareness. "I'll answer the question that most of this body has been asking since the engagement," I said, "because I am told it is the most common question, in various forms, and because I believe the most efficient use of the time you have allocated is to address the most important thing directly." I paused. "The question is whether what humanity demonstrated at Helix 9 represents a threat to the security of other species. The answer is, it depends entirely on what you choose to do." The chamber absorbed that in silence. "Humanity has been building its military capabilities for 20 years, I said. "We have done this carefully, deliberately, and without broadcasting it, because we had the advantage of being underestimated, and underestimated is a good position from which to work when you are building something that needs to be ready before it is needed. We did not advertise what we were building, because the moment you advertise a deterrent, someone begins calculating how to neutralize it before it is complete." I looked at the presiding council. "The capabilities you saw at Helix 9 are real. They are not the totality of what we have built, and they are not pointed at this body, at any member species, or at anyone who has not directly chosen to harm our people." I let that sit. "We want one thing from this galaxy that we did not have before Helix 9. We want it to be clearly understood that harming human civilians, in any number, for any stated purpose, will produce a response that is proportionate to the harm caused and absolute in its commitment. We are not asking for special treatment. We are not claiming an exemption from any law or protocol of this Congress. We are stating, plainly and on the record, that humanity will protect its own people with everything it has built, and that what it has built is sufficient for that purpose." I folded my hands in front of me. "If your species has no intention of harming human civilians, then nothing I have said should concern you at all. If your species does have such intentions, then I respectfully suggest that the events at Helix 9 represent important information that should factor into your planning." The chamber was very quiet. The Velhari senior council member spoke first, in the measured cadence of someone who had been a public figure for a very long time and knew how to make every word land clearly. The translation system rendered it in English, a half-second behind the original. "Commander Vasquez, this council notes that your statement frames humanity's capabilities in purely defensive terms. This council also notes that defensive capabilities of sufficient strength become, by their nature, offensive in their strategic effect. How does humanity respond to that observation?" I had expected this question too. "With acknowledgement," I said. "You are correct. A deterrent powerful enough to prevent aggression is also, if its owner chooses, powerful enough to commit aggression. I cannot offer you a technical guarantee against that. What I can offer you is this. Humanity's history, across 10,000 years of its own development, contains both our most terrible failures and our most extraordinary commitments to something better. We know what it looks like when power is used for domination rather than protection, because we have done it to each other, more than once, across our own history. We carry that knowledge. It shapes us." I looked directly at the senior council member. "The only honest answer to your question is that humanity's restraint is a choice, not a constraint. and I believe that the events at Helix 9 demonstrate clearly which kind of choice we make. The questions continued for 38 more minutes. I answered all of them. Some were hostile. Some were genuinely curious. Some were the careful, precise questions of species that were running their own calculations about what humanity represented in the new strategic balance of this region of the galaxy, and wanted specific data points to work with. I answered all of them honestly. I did not soften anything, and I did not overstate anything. At the end, when the 40-minute allocation had run its course, and the presiding council was preparing to close the session, something happened that Sophia Okafor later told me was genuinely unprecedented in her 4 years of working at the Congress. One of the delegations, a small species called the Pelthori, who were present as observer members rather than full representatives, because they had applied for Congress membership the previous year and were still in the admission process, stood up from their observer position at the back of the chamber. Their representative was a slight, pale creature who looked, by the standards of galactic species, very young, and who spoke in a voice that the translation system rendered as quiet and very precise. "This delegation does not have a formal question," the Pelthori representative said. "We have a statement. We ask the council's indulgence for 30 seconds. The senior council member, after a moment, nodded. The Pelthori representative looked at me. 3 years ago, they said, the Murith Collective conducted what it described as a resource acquisition operation on our outer settlements. 1,400 of our people were removed from their homes and have not been returned. We have filed 62 formal complaints with this Congress. We have received 62 formal acknowledgments and no action." The chamber was very still. "We would like to know," the Pelthori representative said, "if Commander Vasquez would be willing to speak with our delegation after this session concludes." I looked at this small person standing in the back of a room full of 200 species and 50 years of accumulated diplomatic procedure, and 6 decades of formal complaints going nowhere, asking the only question that had ever actually mattered to them. "Yes," I said, "I would be honored to." Owen, standing slightly behind and to my left, said nothing, but I heard him exhale slowly, the way a person exhales when something that was uncertain has resolved in the direction they had hoped. We stayed at the Congress station for 3 more days. The Pelthori meeting was the first of 11 that Owen and I attended in those 3 days. Not formal meetings. None of them had been scheduled in advance. None of them went through official Congress channels. They were the kind of meetings that happen in small conference rooms and quiet corridors, and the less trafficked sections of a station's common areas, where a delegation representative finds you through Sophia Okafor or through Ambassador Delacroix's office and asks, very quietly, whether you have a few minutes. I had a few minutes for all of them. The pattern in those meetings was consistent enough that I started to anticipate it after the third one. A representative of a small or mid-sized species, usually not the senior member of their delegation, usually someone who had been waiting in the outer areas of the Congress's formal process for years or decades. A situation involving a larger neighbor who had taken something, displaced someone, claimed resources or territory or population that did not belong to them. A stack of formal complaints filed with the Congress, acknowledged and unaddressed. A careful, precise question about whether humanity's stated position extended to them. I was honest with all of them. I told each one that my personal presence at a meeting did not represent an official commitment from Earth's government or its military. I told them that decisions about extending formal protection relationships were made at levels above my authority and required processes that took time. I told them that I could not promise them a warship would appear in their system the next time their larger neighbor made an aggressive move. What I told them, that I believed and that was true, was that the events at Helix 9 and the public statement I had made in the Congress chamber were on the record, and that record said something specific about what humanity valued, and that value was not limited to human lives only. We came to these stars, I told the 8th delegation I met with, a quiet pair of representatives from a species called the Alvori, whose star system had been subjected to a decade of slow economic and political strangulation by a larger neighbor, because that is what we do. We explore, we settle, we build, and we bring with us everything we learned at home, which includes a very well-developed sense of what it looks like when a powerful entity systematically deprives a smaller one of its right to exist on its own terms. The senior Alvori representative, an elderly individual by their species standards, looked at me with an expression that translated across species lines with perfect clarity. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time and was not yet certain whether they were being offered relief or just a more comfortable version of the same burden. "What would you ask us to do?" they said. "Document everything," I said. "Every incident, every action, every communication. Build a record that is accurate and complete and accessible. Make certain that your documentation is in a format that the Congress monitoring systems can ingest, and send a copy to Earth's diplomatic office, addressed directly to Ambassador Delacroix. And then continue living," I said. "Continue building. Continue being exactly what you are, which by every account I've read, is a species of remarkable craftsmanship and extraordinary dedication to their communities. Do not let the behavior of your neighbor define the shape of your life." The second Alvori representative, who had been silent throughout, spoke for the first time. "That is easier advice to give than to follow." "Yes," I said honestly. "It is. I am sorry that I do not have a faster answer." Owen, who sat beside me in every one of these meetings, and said very little but absorbed everything, waited until we were walking back through the corridor, toward our quarters, on the fourth evening, and then said, quietly, 17 species today, across 3 days, including the formal session. 3 more have sent requests through Sophia Okafor for meetings tomorrow before we leave." "I know," I said. "The traffic monitoring shows that 3 of the major galactic news networks are already running features on what they're calling the helix effect. The framing is that humanity has, inadvertently or deliberately, created a perception among smaller species that it represents a new category of protection in this region of the galaxy. And among the larger species? Mixed," Owen said. "Some are running their own capability assessments and staying quiet while they process. Some are publicly dismissive but privately pulling their military assets back from any zones where human presence is significant. And 3 have contacted Earth's diplomatic office directly in the past week to request what they're describing as bilateral security discussions." "Bilateral security discussions," I said. "It's the diplomatic phrase for, 'We would like to make sure we are not on your list,'" Owen said, without particular emphasis, the way he delivered most of his observations. I thought about what Crane had said about the kind of fear that shapes behavior over the long term, about the difference between deterrence as a concept and deterrence as a lived reality in the strategic calculations of every species in a region of space. "Owen," I said, "when you were monitoring the Tsar fleet during those 41 minutes of silence, before Vrethok spoke again, what were their communication patterns doing?" He thought about it. Owen's memory for data was exceptional. Short-burst internal communications between ship commanders. Very high volume. We captured the traffic, but couldn't decrypt most of it in real time. The analysis team has been working through it since we returned. "What have they found?" "The most common phrase in the decrypted sections," he said, repeated across 14 separate ship-to-ship communications in that window, is a Tsar idiomatic expression that doesn't translate perfectly, but the closest rendering is something like, "We did not know. We did not know." I thought about that for a while. 14 separate commanders, talking to each other in the 41 minutes after the Ghost Squadron had activated and the Graviton Lance had fired twice, and the tactical situation had completely inverted, and the most common thing they were saying to each other was a version of, "We did not know this was possible." It is a strange thing to feel sympathy for an enemy. I am not certain sympathy is precisely the right word, but there is something, when you think about the nature of conflict and the role that misunderstanding plays in it, that responds to the idea of people who did something terrible, not out of evil, but out of a calculation based on incomplete information. They had looked at humanity and seen what they expected to see, a young spacefaring species still learning the rules of a galaxy that other species had been navigating for centuries. They had applied the logic of that assumption and arrived at a conclusion that seemed reasonable given their information. Their information was wrong. "What happens," I said to Owen, "when a species builds its entire strategic posture on an assumption about another species, and the assumption turns out to be incorrect?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Best case, they recalibrate and adjust. Worst case, they dig in and double down, because acknowledging the error feels too costly. Which do you think the sovereignty will do?" "Based on Vrethok's behavior during and after the engagement," he said slowly, I think there's a genuine possibility of recalibration. He's a tactical person. Tactical people, when presented with accurate data that contradicts their assumptions, generally update their models. And the sovereignty's political leadership? That, Owen said, I genuinely do not know. Political leadership responds to different pressures than fleet command. We reached the quarters section. Sophia Okafor was waiting near the entrance with a data tablet, which meant there was more communication to address before the evening was done. 3 more meeting requests, she confirmed, before either of us could ask. Also, Ambassador Delacroix would like a word before you leave tomorrow, and there is a message from Fleet Command marked priority, which I have forwarded to your personal terminal. Priority messages from Fleet Command, in my experience, generally meant that either something new had happened somewhere that required attention, or that my existing actions had produced consequences that needed managing, or both simultaneously. Thank you, Sophia, I said. I'll take the meeting requests in the morning before we depart. Tell the ambassador I'll come to him at 0700. Understood, Commander. I sat down in my quarters and opened the priority message from Fleet Command. It was from Crane. It was 4 sentences long, which was more than she usually used. Sovereignty High Command has requested a direct communication channel with Earth's diplomatic office. They are framing it as a request for clarification of the events at Helix 9. Ambassador Delacroix believes they are looking for a framework within which to address the situation without losing face publicly. Your read on Vrethok suggests this is consistent with his character. Come home when the Congress business is finished. We have work to do. I read it twice. Then I wrote back. The Congress business will finish tomorrow. I'll be home in 48 hours. For what it's worth, I think they genuinely want a way forward that does not require them to pretend the engagement did not happen. Vrethok is not a man who pretends. Whatever he told them when he returned, it was accurate. They know where they stand. They're looking for a door that leads somewhere other than where the current trajectory goes. I sent it. Then I sat quietly in the room for a while. I thought about the Pelthori representative standing up in a chamber full of 200 species and asking if they could speak with me. I thought about 1,400 people removed from their homes who had not come back. I thought about 62 formal complaints, and 62 acknowledgments, and 0 action. I thought about what kind of galaxy we were all living in, and what it would take to make it different, and whether what had happened at Helix 9 was a beginning, or just a very loud single event that would fade into the background noise of galactic history once everyone had finished processing the shock of it. I did not have an answer to that question yet. I did not think I would have an answer for a long time, but I thought about the open channel during the evacuation, and Vrethok listening to 41 minutes of human beings, carefully, precisely, completely dedicated to bringing their people home, and saying nothing. And I thought that maybe the most important thing we had shown that day was not the weapons or the doctrine or the strategic preparation. Maybe the most important thing was that we showed up, and we brought everyone home, and we could do it again. The sovereignty's request for a direct channel was handled by Ambassador Delacroix's office, which was the appropriate place for it to land, and the negotiations that followed were conducted over a period of 6 weeks by diplomats and strategic advisors and legal specialists from both sides, who were far better suited to the specific work of building frameworks and precedents than I was. I know this because Delacroix sent me updates, not official briefings, personal notes, the kind that a person sends when they have been in a process long enough to need to say what they actually think to someone who will understand it. He wrote, in the 3rd week, they keep asking about Vrethok, specifically about what you said to him privately on the channel versus what was broadcast publicly. I tell them the channel was open throughout, and everything said was public. They don't quite believe me. They think there must have been a private negotiation that produced the specific outcome, the disarmed flagship, the withdrawal, the order to open the corridors. They cannot accept that those outcomes were produced by the public statements alone. He wrote, in the 5th week, progress. They've agreed in principle to a framework that addresses the status of Helix 9's remaining infrastructure and the question of compensation for the civilian losses. The number they've offered is inadequate, but it's a starting position, which is different from nothing. More importantly, they've stopped asking us to characterize what happened as a mutual engagement and started using language that acknowledges they initiated the action. He wrote, the day before the framework agreement was signed, it is done, or mostly done. There are pieces that will be argued over for another decade by people who make their careers on pieces, but the core of it holds. I thought you should know before the formal announcement. You started something here that was larger than one engagement. I'm not certain any of us fully know yet what we've started, but it holds. I read that message 3 times. Then I received the new sealed orders that Crane had promised, and I stopped reading personal notes and started reading what came next. What came next was a system called the Varan Cluster, 7 inhabited worlds in the mid-galactic belt, where 3 separate ongoing territorial disputes had, in the 6 weeks since Helix 9, entered a phase that Earth's intelligence division described as rapidly escalating toward direct conflict. The Varan Cluster had been a point of tension for decades. Nobody had done anything dramatically terrible there yet, but the intelligence assessment was that somebody was about to. My orders were to take the unbroken will into the cluster, make our presence known, and conduct diplomatic and tactical assessment, which was the kind of order that sounds straightforward, and is in practice an enormously complicated balancing act between being present enough to matter and being present in a way that creates the very escalation you are trying to prevent. Crane had added a handwritten note at the end of the sealed orders, which was not standard practice, but Crane occasionally did non-standard things when she felt the standard approach was insufficient. The note said, "The cluster is watching what happened at Helix 9, the same way everyone else is. They are trying to calculate what your presence means before they decide whether to continue their current trajectories. The calculation they run will depend on what you do when you get there. Trust your read. Trust your read." I had been trusting my read since I pressed the broadcast button in front of 50 Tsar warships. So far it had not gotten anyone killed who was not already trying to kill someone else. I intended to maintain that record. We left for the Varan Cluster 11 days after I returned from the Congress station. The crew of the Unbroken Will had spent those 11 days in rest and resupply, and the kind of deep maintenance that a ship needs after an engagement in which it operates at the upper limits of its capability. Philip Rourke had been in the engineering section for most of those 11 days, with a team of 12, running checks and recalibrations with the systematic thoroughness of someone who considered a functioning ship not just a professional responsibility, but a personal one. The night before departure, Owen knocked on my cabin door. This was unusual. Owen communicated through the ship's internal systems when he needed to reach me professionally, and generally respected the boundary between professional hours and personal ones. A physical knock at my door in the evening meant something different. "Come in," I said. He came in and stood in the middle of the cabin with his hands at his sides, which was his version of slightly uncertain body language. Owen Price, in the 2 years we had worked together, had shown me approximately 4 emotions with any clarity. This was one of the subtler ones. "I've been going through the long-term communication traffic from the Tsar sovereignty," he said. "Not the diplomatic channel, the broader public signals, news services, official broadcasts, that kind of thing. And there is something happening in their public communications that I want to make sure you're aware of before we leave for the cluster." He paused. Vrethok gave a public address to the Sovereignty's Central Command Council 4 days after he returned from Helix 9. It was classified, not publicly broadcast, but we intercepted it through standard intelligence channels. I've been working through the analysis. What did he say? Owen pulled out a data tablet and looked at it briefly. Not because he needed to read from it. Owen essentially never needed to read from anything, but because it gave him something to do with his hands when he was being careful about how he said something. He said that the Sovereignty had been operating on an inaccurate model of humanity for the entirety of its contact period. He recommended a complete reassessment of every strategic position that incorporated assumptions about human capabilities or intentions. He recommended immediate withdrawal of Sovereignty assets from 3 zones where their presence was predicated on the assumption that Earth would not respond militarily. "That's significant," I said. "It is, but that's not the part I thought you should hear before we leave." I waited. He also said, Owen continued, still looking at the tablet he didn't need, that in 31 years of fleet command, the engagement at Helix 9 was the first time he had encountered a military opponent who was, in his words, more dedicated to completing their mission than to defeating the enemy. He said that the distinction between those 2 goals was one he had not previously recognized as meaningful. He said it was the most important tactical education he had received in his career. I sat with that for a moment. More dedicated to completing the mission than to defeating the enemy. I said slowly. Yes. I thought about the 47 minutes of engagement, about the graviton lance shots, specifically targeted to disable rather than destroy wherever possible, about the Ghost Squadron's coordinated fire, designed to break the formation rather than annihilate it, about the open channel during the evacuation, and the 41 minutes of silence, and Vrethok watching us bring people home. He understood, I said, mostly to myself. He understood, Owen confirmed. We were quiet for a moment. Why did you want to tell me tonight? I said. Owen set the data tablet down on the small table near the door. Because we're going to the Varen cluster tomorrow, and the situation there is different from Helix 9. There's no clear aggressor, no single action that defines who is in the wrong. It's a tangle of old disputes and competing claims, and 100 years of grievances running in several directions at once. He paused. The lesson Vrethok learned might be the most useful tool we carry into that situation. I looked at him, more dedicated to completing the mission than to defeating the enemy. Yes. If the parties in the cluster see us that way, before anything happens that requires a harder response, then maybe things can be resolved without going to the place Helix 9 went. It was good thinking. It was the kind of thinking that I had learned to recognize in Owen Price, in the same way that you learn to recognize the quality of light at a particular time of day, by accumulation, by watching it often enough that it becomes familiar. Get some sleep, I said. We leave at 0600. Yes, Commander. He picked up his tablet and moved to the door, then stopped. One more thing. Owen. There's a message in the civilian network from Cole Harrington. He's been appointed to lead the Helix 9 Reconstruction Committee. He's asking if you'd be willing to be listed as an honorary advisor to the project. A pause. He says he understands if operational commitments make it impossible, but wanted to ask directly. I thought about Cole Harrington broadcasting 2 words on a loop into open space. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Tell him yes, I said. Tell him to send me the project updates through the standard civilian network channel, and I'll review them whenever I'm able. I'll tell him. Owen opened the door. Good night, Commander. Good night, Owen. The door closed. I sat alone in my cabin on the night before we departed for a system where 3 sets of people were trying to figure out whether to trust that the galaxy had changed, and I thought about what it meant to carry a mission that was larger than any single engagement. What it meant to be the visible edge of something that had been building in quiet and careful ways for 20 years, now suddenly in full view of everyone, now required to be not just capable, but clear about what it was and what it intended. I thought about Vrethok's words, more dedicated to the mission than to the enemy. The mission at the Varen cluster was not to win a fight. The mission was to make the fight unnecessary. I thought that was, of all the missions I had ever received, probably the most important one. At 0600 the next morning, I walked onto the bridge of the ISS Unbroken Will. Owen was already at his console, running his preliminary sensor sweeps with the quiet precision that defined everything he did. Nadia Lowe was at comms, running her channel checks. Felix Marsh was at navigation, course already set, and waiting for my order. Philip Rourke had called up from engineering at 0558 to report all systems fully operational and ready. I sat down in my command chair. I looked at the forward display, at the star field ahead of us, at the route that would take us through 2 FTL jumps to the edge of the Varen cluster. Felix, I said, engage. The stars shifted. We had work to do. The Varen cluster arrived on our sensors before we fully completed the second FTL jump. 7 inhabited worlds in a relatively compact star system, 3 of them sharing overlapping orbital resource zones that had been the source of dispute since before any of them had developed spaceflight. The other 4 had been drawn into the disputes gradually, through alliance, through dependency, through the slow accumulation of grievances and cross-border incidents that characterizes conflicts that have been running long enough that nobody alive remembers a time before them. Goen's initial sensor sweep took 11 minutes and produced a picture that was consistent with the intelligence briefing I had read on the journey. 14 armed vessels distributed across the cluster, belonging to 4 different factions, all of them in holding positions that were technically within their own claimed space, and tactically designed to be within optimal engagement range of at least one opponent's critical assets. The mathematical formality of a conflict about to start. 14 armed vessels, I said. Confirmed. None of them are in the class of what we encountered at Helix 9. These are patrol craft and light cruisers mostly. No dreadnoughts, no heavy assault classes. The largest single vessel in the cluster is a mid-range cruiser belonging to the Veshan faction, about a third of the tonnage of Vrethok's flagship. Weapons ready status? Half of them are at elevated charge. Not full ready, but they're not cold either. They've been like this for approximately 2 weeks based on the power cycle patterns. 2 weeks of sitting at elevated charge. That level of sustained readiness produces a particular kind of pressure on a crew. It is exhausting. It makes people jumpy. And jumpy people with elevated weapons charge in a cluster of 14 ships, pointed at each other, were a situation that did not require much additional input to transition from a tense holding pattern to something much worse. Nadia, I said, I want to broadcast on the common frequency for this cluster. What's the standard hailing channel? Nadia found it in her records. The cluster uses a shared emergency and coordination frequency that all 4 factions have access to. It was established 12 years ago after an accidental collision in a resource zone nearly started a full conflict. All 14 vessels should be monitoring it. Good. Open it. The channel opened. I had decided, on the journey, that the approach here needed to be different from Helix 9. At Helix 9, the situation required immediacy and absolute clarity, and there was a clear wrong party and a clear right party, and my job was to intervene decisively. In the Varen cluster, the situation was a tangle, and the wrong parties were everyone, and the right parties were also everyone, in the complicated way that conflicts built on a century of legitimate and illegitimate grievances tend to be. Decisive intervention here was not the answer. Decisive presence was. This is Commander Yara Vasquez, of the United Earth Navy warship ISS Unbroken Will, I said. We have arrived in the Varen cluster, and we will be remaining in this system for the foreseeable future. I paused for exactly 2 seconds. We are not here because any party in this cluster has done anything that required our response. We are here because the current trajectory of this situation is one that the United Earth Navy has assessed as likely to produce outcomes that no party in this cluster actually wants. We are here to change the trajectory, not by force, but by presence. I looked at Owen. He was watching his sensor display, tracking the response of all 14 vessels. He held up 2 fingers, then 3. Communication traffic spiking across the cluster as the factions processed what they were hearing. We are aware of the history of the disputes in this system, I continued. We are aware that they are complex, that they have been running for a long time, and that simple solutions have been offered and have failed for reasons that are, in context, understandable. We are not here to offer simple solutions. Another pause. We are here because in the past several weeks, humanity has made a public commitment about the kind of presence we intend to maintain in this region of the galaxy. That commitment includes a genuine interest in the stability and well-being of all communities in this region, not just human ones. The Varen cluster is part of this region. The 7 billion people living across your 7 worlds are part of this region. I looked at the forward display. We would like to meet with representatives of all 4 factions within the next 48 hours. Not to adjudicate your disputes, that is not within our authority or our intent, but to understand what you each need, what you each fear, and whether there is anything that our presence and our resources can do to make the path forward less dangerous than it currently appears. I closed the channel. Owen said, without looking up. 11 of the 14 vessels have reduced their weapons charge in the past 2 minutes. The other 3 are holding, but their communication traffic has shifted from tactical coordination to what looks like internal command discussion. How long before we get a formal response? Based on the traffic patterns, somewhere between 2 and 6 hours. They need to talk to each other before they talk to us. That's reasonable, I said. The response came in 4 hours and 20 minutes. It was a joint communication, which was itself significant, requiring all 4 faction commanders to agree on a single message, which was the first time since the crisis began that they had communicated jointly about anything. The message said, in its translated form, "We acknowledge the arrival of the ISS Unbroken Will. We are prepared to send representatives to discuss the situation in the Varen cluster. We ask only that Commander Vasquez be present at the discussions personally." I read it, and then I read it again, and I noticed the thing it said that was most important. which was not the acknowledgement or the willingness to send representatives. It was the request that I be present personally. Not that a human representative be present. Not that the United Earth Navy send a diplomatic team. Me, specifically, the person who had stood in front of 50 Tsar warships and spoken 7 words on a fleet-wide channel. They were not asking for Earth's power. They were asking for the thing that had made the power comprehensible. They were asking for the quality that Vrethok had put into words without intending to, more dedicated to completing the mission than to defeating the enemy. They had seen, in the record of what happened at Helix 9, something that was not just capability but intent, and they wanted to be in the same room with the person who had demonstrated that intent, and they wanted to see, up close, whether it was real. Tell them yes, I said to Nadia. The meetings began the next morning, and ran for 3 days. I attended every session. I listened to more than I spoke, which is not a natural tendency for me, but is often the more useful one. I heard the Veshan faction describe a resource claim that had been established before the other factions arrived in the system, and had been steadily eroded over decades. Through informal encroachment they lacked the military strength to resist. I heard the Calvori faction describe how their entire economic base had been cut off by Veshan trade restrictions, implemented in retaliation for those encroachments. I heard the other 2 factions describe their positions, which were in both cases partly legitimate, and partly the opportunistic elaboration of grievances that had expanded to fill the space that the primary dispute had created. It was exactly as complicated as the intelligence briefing had suggested. There were no heroes and no pure villains, just people who had been accumulating injuries for long enough that the injuries had become load-bearing walls in how they understood themselves and their situation. On the second day, during a break in the formal sessions, the Veshan faction's representative, a small, careful person named Joran Eld, approached me in the corridor outside the meeting room. "Commander Vasquez," Eld said, "may I ask you something informally?" "Yes," I said. "Do you believe this is solvable?" Eld asked. "I mean genuinely, not in the diplomatic sense of finding language that all parties can accept, in the real sense of things actually being better, rather than just described differently." It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. "I think it is solvable in the real sense," I said, "but I think the solution requires each party to accept an honest accounting of what they have done to the others, not just what has been done to them. That is the hard part, and it is the part that diplomatic language is often used to avoid." Eld looked at me steadily. "And if the accounting is done honestly, and some parties find they owe more than they expected, then they pay," I said. "Not all at once, not in a way that destroys them, but they pay, because the alternative is to keep running this accounting in arrears indefinitely, and the interest on that eventually comes due in a way that is much harder to absorb than the original principle." Eld was quiet for a long moment. "You speak about this the way someone speaks about something they have learned from their own experience." "Humanity spent 10,000 years learning it from our own experience," I said. "We paid the interest on a great many things the hard way. We would rather not watch other people do the same, if it can be avoided." Eld nodded slowly. "We will try," they said. "I cannot promise more than that." "Trying honestly is enough to start with," I said. "It is usually what everything else grows from." The framework agreement for the Varan cluster, the first substantive one in the system's 40 years of formal dispute, was signed 14 weeks after we arrived. I was not present for the signing. I had been called away 6 weeks before its conclusion to a different situation in a different part of the galaxy. But Owen, who remained as Earth's on-site military liaison for the final weeks of negotiation, sent me a message the evening it was signed. The message contained 2 sentences. They signed it. "Joran Eld said to tell you that they tried honestly." I read it 3 times. Then I went back to work on the situation I had been called to, which was in a different system and involved different parties, and was in its own way just as complicated and just as human, in all the ways that the word human has come to mean more than just our own species, but the quality of attention and commitment and refusal to let people be abandoned that we carried out into the stars with us. Every time, without exception. That is the mission, not the specific engagement, not the specific system, not the specific set of names and factions and grievances. The mission is the commitment itself. The decision, made before we knew any particular set of names or any particular set of circumstances, that the people behind us are worth protecting, and that we will do the work to protect them. I made that decision before Helix 9. I make it fresh every morning, when I sit down in the command chair and look at the stars ahead. It does not get lighter with repetition. You do not become accustomed to the weight of it, but you do get better at carrying it without letting the weight change your stride. That is all I know how to tell you about how it works. The rest is just showing up, every time, with everything you have. 14 months after Helix 9, the Galactic Congress amended its founding charter for the first time in 60 years. The amendment was not dramatic in its language. Charter amendments rarely are, because people who write them have learned, usually through hard experience, that dramatic language creates ambiguities that are exploited at inconvenient moments. The amendment was precise, careful, and had been negotiated over 11 weeks by 43 delegations, including Earth's. What it said, in its precise and careful language, was that the Congress recognized an obligation of active response, not just formal acknowledgement, when a member species filed a substantiated complaint of harm against its civilian population by another member or non-member entity. Active response. Not a strongly worded statement, not a formal acknowledgement, a response that was required to actually do something. The Pelthori, who were still in their observer admission process when the amendment passed, were granted full membership 2 weeks later, in what the Congress's official record described as an accelerated timeline consistent with the body's renewed commitment to substantive engagement with emerging species. Their 1,400 people who had been removed from their homes were not all returned. The process of getting them back was complicated and slow, and full of the kinds of legal arguments that take years to resolve. But it was a process. It was moving. There was a structure and a timeline, and a set of people whose job it was to ensure it continued. That was different from before. I know this because Ambassador Delacroix sent me the detailed summary of the amendment's passage with a note attached that read, "This required all 11 weeks and would not have been possible 6 months ago. You should know that." I was sitting in the observation bay of the Unbroken Will when I read that message, watching a star system I will not name here go through the process of becoming, slowly and imperfectly, something better than it had been when we arrived. The observation bay is not a tactical space. It does not appear in any operational manual or mission briefing as a location where commanders are expected to spend time. It is a small room with a large curved viewport and a bench, and no other furniture, which exists because some of the engineers who designed the Unbroken Will understood that people who spend extended periods in space need places to simply sit and look at it, not analyze it, not assess it, not track targets or evaluate approach vectors, just look. I spent a fair amount of time in the observation bay in the 14 months after Helix 9, more than was probably optimal from a productivity standpoint. I thought a lot in those months, about what had changed and what hadn't, about the gap between the clarity of a specific moment like the engagement at Helix 9 and the long, complicated, often frustratingly slow processes that followed it, about how change actually works, in practice, when you are not in the middle of a crisis, but in the much larger, much less dramatic, and infinitely more difficult work of building something new on the other side of one. The change that happened most clearly, in the 14 months after Helix 9, was in what Crane described in one of her briefings as the calculus of casual aggression. The phrase sounds technical, but it describes something very specific, the calculation that a larger, more powerful entity makes before doing something harmful to a smaller one, based on the expected cost versus the expected benefit. Before Helix 9, the calculus for certain kinds of aggression, specifically the kind directed at human communities or communities closely associated with human interests, produced an outcome that justified proceeding. The expected cost was low. The expected benefit, whether in resources, territory, political positioning, or simple leverage, was significant. After Helix 9, the calculus changed. Owen tracked the changes through the communication traffic he monitored across 37 different species' diplomatic and military networks. He produced a weekly summary that I read carefully, because it was the most honest accounting I had of what was actually shifting in the broader galaxy, versus what was being publicly claimed to be shifting. What was actually shifting was this. In 8 separate situations across 4 months, an entity that had been on what Owen called a pre-aggressive trajectory toward a human-affiliated community made a visible decision to stop, not because they were intercepted, or confronted, or warned through any direct channel, because they ran the calculation, and the calculation came out differently. 8 times. 4 months. No direct intervention required. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt when I read those summaries. It was not triumph. It was not pride, exactly. It was something closer to the feeling of watching a seed germinate, a thing you planted under difficult conditions, and were not certain would take root, showing the first evidence that it had. The cost of those 8 situations not escalating was not zero. It was paid in the currency of every month of preparation over 20 years. Every ship built in a classified facility. Every doctrine refined in a war college simulation room. Every crew member trained and ready. The seed had been expensive to plant, and the cost was real, and it belonged to real people, including 4,200 people, whose names Cole Harrington carried in his memory, and who would never know that the thing their deaths contributed to, the evidence that demonstrated to the galaxy what humanity's response looked like, had produced those 8 quiet non-events in the months that followed. That is a difficult thing to think about clearly. I am not certain I always manage it. What I know is that I carry their names too, all 4,211 of them, not as a list. I did not memorize a list, but as a weight, a real and specific weight that I feel in different ways on different days, and that I think is appropriate to feel, and that I believe it would be wrong to set down. 15 months after Helix 9, I met Cole Harrington in person for the first time. He had come to Earth as part of his work on the Reconstruction Committee, attending a series of meetings with various government offices and funding bodies and logistics coordinators. He sent me a message through the civilian network asking if I had any time while he was in the city, and I made time. We met at a public park near the government district, which was his choice of location. He explained afterward that he had been in meeting rooms for 4 consecutive days and wanted to be outside, which I completely understood. He was a larger man than his voice had suggested, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent years working with their hands before moving into administrative roles. He had, as I had imagined from his voice, the kind of face that showed what it had been through, without attempting to hide it. He looked like a person who had kept 8,000 people alive through the worst 20 hours of their lives, and was now carrying the work of honoring the 4,000 who had not made it. And both of those things showed. We shook hands. We sat down on a bench. For a moment, neither of us said anything. "You're shorter than I imagined," he said. "People usually say that," I said. He smiled. It was a real smile, not the performed kind that people use in situations they are uncertain how to navigate. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 15 months, he said. "I wrote and deleted about 30 versions of this conversation. What made you decide to meet anyway?" "I figured anything I actually said in person would be better than the best version I could write," he said. That turned out to be true in every important conversation I've ever had, and I thought it would probably be true here too. I nodded. "What did you want to say?" He looked out at the park for a moment. There were people in it, the ordinary, irreplaceable activity of people going about their ordinary lives, families and individuals and groups of friends, all of them presumably unaware that they were being observed by someone who had looked at the most complete version of what those ordinary lives are worth when the calculation is forced by circumstances. "I wanted to say that I understand more now than I did in those first weeks," he said, "about what happened and why, and what it means going forward. I've had a lot of time to read and think, and I've spoken with people in the government, and people in the military, and people who work on the kind of long-term strategic planning that apparently goes on in places I was not previously aware existed." He turned to look at me. "I understand that what happened at Helix 9 was not just a rescue operation. I understand that the way it was done, the specific choices made, the things said on the channel, were part of something larger. I understand that the 4,200 who died were not just victims of an atrocity, but became, in the aftermath, part of a demonstration that changed something significant about the way this part of the galaxy works." He stopped for a moment. "I am still working out how to feel about that," he said honestly. "I understand," I said. "Do you?" He was not challenging me. He was genuinely asking. "I carry their names too," I said. "Not in the same way you do. You knew them. I didn't. But I carry what they represent, and I think about whether I made the right calls, and whether different decisions might have produced a different outcome, and whether the outcome that was produced is worth what it cost. I looked at the park. I don't have a clean answer to any of those questions. I think clean answers are probably not available here. Cole Harrington was quiet for a while. George Albright, he said finally, the name of the head farmer who had developed new growing techniques. He had a daughter. She was 8. She was in the upper ring with her school group the day it happened, so she survived. Her name is Mia. She's 10 now. She comes to the reconstruction planning meetings sometimes, because her teacher brings the school group in to understand what is being built back. He looked at his hands. She asked me last month what her father's work had grown. Not in the hydroponic bays, in the broader sense. She's 10, and she asked that question. He was quiet again. I didn't know what to tell her. I thought about it carefully. Tell her it grew something that doesn't have a name yet, I said. Tell her that her father spent his life figuring out how to make things grow in conditions that were not designed for growing, and that the work he did in that station, the specific techniques he developed, were noted in the Reconstruction Committee's records, and are being incorporated into the design of the new station. Tell her that his methods will grow food for people who haven't been born yet. Cole looked at me. And tell her, I said, that what happened at Helix 9, all of it, the worst parts, and the parts that came after, is still growing too, into something we can see the outlines of but can't fully describe yet. Something that belongs, in part, to her father, and to all 4,200 of them, and that we are trying to make sure that what it grows into is worth the cost. He did not say anything for a long time. We sat in the park, 2 people who had been in different parts of the worst day either of them had ever encountered, watching ordinary life go on around them. Finally, he said, I'll tell her. We sat there for a while longer. Then he had to go to his next meeting, and I had to go back to Fleet Command, and we shook hands again at the edge of the park. Commander, he said. Call me Yara, I said. He nodded. Yara, thank you for making the time. I watched him walk away in the direction of the government district, a large man with a straightforward walk, carrying something heavy and choosing to carry it carefully. I went back to work. 2 years after Helix 9, Admiral Crane called me into her office for what was described in the scheduling system as a strategic review, which was the category she used for conversations that did not fit neatly into the other available categories. She was standing at her window when I arrived, looking out at the city below Fleet Command headquarters. It was late in the afternoon, and the light was coming in at a low angle that made the buildings look different from how they looked at other times of day. She did not turn around immediately. I waited. 17 bilateral security agreements, she said, still looking out the window. In 2 years, 17 species who formally approached Earth through diplomatic channels and requested a security relationship. Do you know what the total was in the previous 20 years? 2, I said. She turned from the window then. 2. In 20 years, 17 in 2. She crossed to her desk and sat down. The Congress Amendment, the Pelthori membership, the Varan framework, the 3 secondary agreements that grew out of the Varan framework between parties who were not even the primary disputants, the 4 situations Owen flagged, where aggressive trajectories reversed without any direct intervention from us. She set a document down on the desk. I could see from where I stood that it was a strategic assessment, the kind produced by the analytical division, dense with numbers and projections, and the kind of language that tries to quantify things that are fundamentally not very quantifiable. The assessment says, she said, that the Helix 9 engagement and its aftermath have produced a measurable shift in the strategic environment of this region of the galaxy that is consistent with a reduction in large-scale conflict probability over the next 15 years, assuming no major reversal of the current trends. That's significant, I said. It's the most significant strategic shift in Earth's history as a spacefaring civilization, she said, without drama. It is also, and I want you to understand this clearly, a beginning. Not an ending, not a resolution, not a guarantee. A beginning. I understood that. I had understood it since the morning after Helix 9, when I woke up and lay in the bunk on the unbroken will and thought about what came next rather than what had just happened. There are still entities in this galaxy, she continued, who have not recalibrated, who have watched what happened and concluded that the solution is not to stop the behavior that triggered it, but to develop a capability to neutralize what was demonstrated. We know this because Owen's monitoring shows specific patterns consistent with accelerated military development programs in 3 separate entities that did not previously have active programs at that scale. They're building to catch up, I said. They're trying to, she said. Which means the advantage we held at Helix 9 is not static. It is a function of the pace of development, and if we slow down while others accelerate, the gap narrows. She said this not with alarm, but with the same flat, clear tone she used for everything that was simply true and needed to be acknowledged as such. "The new orders you received last week," she said. "The classified ones." "Yes," I said. "They represent the next phase of what Helix 9 began. Broader reach, more complex situations, some of them with less clear-cut right and wrong sides than we had at Helix 9. She looked at me steadily. "You've been doing this work for 2 years now. You've handled a dozen situations of varying complexity. I want to know, honestly, whether you are finding the work sustainable." It was an unusual question from Crane. She did not typically ask about the interior experience of the work. She asked about its outcomes. "Sustainable is an interesting word for it," I said carefully. "I don't think the work is supposed to feel easy. I think if it started to feel easy, that would mean I had stopped paying proper attention to what it actually costs." She nodded slowly. "And the weight of what it costs is present," I said. "Every day, the 4,200, the situations where we got there in time, and the ones we didn't, because there have been some of those. The 1,400 Pelthori, who are still in the process of coming home. The things we haven't been able to change yet. And you carry all of that and still function." "I carry all of that and still function," I confirmed. "I don't think functioning despite the weight is the goal. I think functioning because of it might be closer. The weight is what keeps me paying attention to what I'm doing, and why." Crane was quiet for a moment. "You have the ship," she said finally, and it sounded like a conclusion. "Whatever comes next, you have the ship and the crew, and you know the mission. That's what I needed to hear." "Is that what this meeting was about?" I asked. "Partly," she said. She picked up a different document from her desk. "The other part is this. The Galactic Congress has formally requested that Earth establish a permanent advisory presence in the Congress Station. Not a diplomatic role, that's Delacroix's territory, and his team is doing excellent work. A military advisory role. A commander who can speak to military situations with direct operational knowledge." She set the document down. "They've asked for you specifically," she said. "The request names you and describes your qualifications as, and I'm reading directly here, demonstrated capacity for the exercise of significant force with evident commitment to the minimization of harm. That is the Congress's official language for what you did at Helix 9. Demonstrated capacity for significant force with evident commitment to the minimization of harm," I said. "Yes." Crane allowed something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. "I thought you'd appreciate the phrasing." "It's accurate," I said. "It is," she agreed. "The question is whether you want the role. It would mean a significant shift in your primary function. Less direct operational command, more advisory and presence-based work. You would keep the unbroken will as your base of operations and transport, and you would retain the authority to respond to direct threats to human communities when they arise. But the primary daily work would be the slower, quieter kind of thing you've been doing in places like the Varen cluster." I thought about Joran Eld saying, "We will try." I thought about the 14 weeks in the Varen cluster, and the framework agreement that had come out of it. I thought about the 11 situations that Owen had flagged, where things had shifted in a direction that reduced harm, and about the fact that most of them were invisible, unrecorded, unknown to anyone, except the people whose lives were different because they occurred. I thought about what it meant to be present, just present, visible, clearly committed, in a place where people are watching, and calculating, and trying to determine whether the galaxy had actually changed, or whether the change was only in one specific sector, at one specific moment, and had not extended to where they lived. "The quiet work is harder than the visible work," I said. "People understand the visible work. The quiet work requires trusting a process that doesn't have clear milestone moments." "Yes," Crane said. "It requires trusting that presence itself is a form of action. That being there, consistently, honestly, in the way that you are, is doing something even when nothing dramatic is happening. I thought about that. Tell the Congress yes, I said, but I want Owen with me. His monitoring work is essential to the advisory function, and he's developed a read on the galactic landscape that would take years to rebuild in someone new. Owen Price is already on the request, Crane said. The Congress specifically included him. Apparently his presence in the Varen negotiation sessions made an impression. I was not surprised. Owen's kind of quiet, precise, completely reliable intelligence has a way of making impressions without announcing itself. When do we start? I said. When you're ready, she said. The Congress has not set a deadline. They know that the value of this role depends on the right person occupying it, and they are apparently confident enough in their judgment about the right person to be patient about the timing. I stood up. I'll need 2 weeks, I said. I have some personal business to complete, and a message to send to Cole Harrington. Because if I'm shifting to an advisory role, I need to adjust how I participate in the Reconstruction Committee, and he deserves to hear that from me directly. 2 weeks is fine, Crane said. She picked up her pen, which meant the meeting was concluded. Then she stopped and looked at me one more time, with an expression I had not seen from her before, or had seen only so briefly in individual moments that I had not been certain it was there. You did something important, Vasquez, she said. Not just at Helix 9, in the 2 years since. The way you carried it forward, the consistency of it. She looked back at her desk. That matters. Make sure you know that it does. I left without saying anything in response, because there was nothing to say that would not be inadequate. I walked down the corridor from her office, past the people who were doing the work of the building, the analysts, and the junior officers and the administrative staff and the logistics specialists, all of them running the long, continuous project of keeping humanity's commitment to itself and to the broader galaxy operational on a daily basis. I went home that evening to my apartment, which I had not spent a great deal of time in over the past 2 years. I made dinner. I opened the window and let in the evening air. I sat at the table for a while, not doing anything, just sitting. I thought about Mia Albright, who was 10 years old and had asked what her father's work had grown. I thought about what I would tell her when she was older and could understand the full answer, which was that it was still growing, and that we were still carrying it, and that it had reached places her father had never imagined it would reach, and that it would keep going further still, because that is the nature of the things that are planted at cost. They do not stop when the cost is finished being paid. They keep growing into whatever the soil allows. The evening air came in through the open window. I sat with it until it was time to sleep. Then I went to work in the morning. That is the whole of it. 3 years after Helix 9, I grow tomatoes. It is, I recognize, an absurd thing to do. The commander of Earth's advisory presence at the Galactic Congress, the person whose name appears in the strategic assessments of 43 different species as a significant variable in their long-term planning, grows tomatoes in a small raised bed outside the quarters assigned to me on the Congress station. The quarters have a small exterior space, a narrow balcony-adjacent area that was designed for the atmospheric needs of a different species, and repurposed after that delegation relocated to a larger unit. I use it for the tomatoes. Owen Price, who maintains the adjacent quarters, did not comment on the tomatoes when they first appeared. He has a gift for not commenting on things that do not require comment, which is one of his most useful qualities. He did, however, bring me a bag of nutrient supplement from the station's civilian market 3 weeks after the tomatoes were planted, without being asked, and leave it outside my door with a note that said, "Only for the project," which I thought was characteristic of him in the best way. The tomatoes are growing. They should not be, technically, because the light source on this station is calibrated for the atmospheric and spectral needs of 17 different species, and none of those species are native to Earth. But tomatoes are, in my observation, possessed of the same quality that I have noticed in humans generally. They will grow in conditions that were not designed for them, if the basic requirements are met and someone is paying attention. I pay attention. The tomatoes grow. This is my 3rd year on the Congress station. I have been here long enough that the work has developed its own rhythms, its own familiar patterns of who comes to speak with me and about what, its own understanding of which crises are genuine emergencies and which are the performance of crisis that sometimes characterizes political situations where the real decisions are being made in other rooms. I have gotten better at distinguishing them. That is the work of 3 years. In those 3 years, the Galactic Congress has passed 11 additional amendments to its charter, 7 of which directly address situations involving harm to civilian populations. It has admitted 14 new member species, 4 of them on the accelerated timeline that the Pelthori precedent established. It has created, for the first time in its history, an active response division, a small team of representatives from species who have committed actual resources, not just formal acknowledgments, to situations where the Charter's active response obligation is triggered. The Active Response Division is not large. It is not, honestly, particularly well funded. It is staffed by people who are there because they chose to be there, rather than because their governments particularly wanted them to be. But it is real, which is different from not existing, and it has acted on 4 situations in 2 years, which is different from 0. I am the military advisor to the Active Response Division. This is the formal title of the role I was asked to fill. In practice, what I do is attend meetings, review situation reports, provide operational assessments of whether proposed responses are realistic given the capabilities of the parties who would carry them out, and occasionally, when a situation has elements that require direct engagement from a human military asset, deploy the Unbroken Will to the relevant location. The Unbroken Will has deployed 6 times in the 3 years I have been at the Congress Station. 4 of those deployments did not require any weapons to be used. The presence of the ship, positioned with the same clarity of intent that I brought to the edge of Helix 9's debris field, was sufficient for the purpose. 2 deployments required a direct engagement, neither of which was as significant as Helix 9 in scale, and neither of which produced a result that the parties involved were willing to describe as a defeat, because by the time the Unbroken Will appeared in their situations, they had each had sufficient time to understand what its presence meant, and to make decisions accordingly. We lost no crew members in any of the 6 deployments. I think about that. I think about it the way I think about the 4,200, with the same weight but a different texture. The weight of what was preserved rather than what was lost is not lighter, it is just differently oriented. Owen has been monitoring the galactic communication traffic for 3 years on the Congress Station. His weekly summaries have become something of an informal legend in the Earth diplomatic and intelligence community, circulated beyond their original distribution list through the mechanisms of people who read something useful and forward it to other people who would find it useful. He does not know how widely they have circulated, and I have not told him, because I suspect he would find it uncomfortable, and his comfort with his work is part of what makes him so good at it. His most recent summary contained a section that I have read 4 times since he sent it, not because it is difficult to understand, but because I want to be certain I am understanding it correctly. The section describes a pattern in the communication traffic of 12 major galactic entities over the past 18 months. The pattern is this. In 12 separate situations where the pre-Helix 9 historical record suggested these entities would have taken aggressive action, they did not. Not because they were intercepted or warned or directly deterred in any of those specific cases, but because the calculation had changed. Owen's analysis of the changed calculation is precise, as his analyses always are. He traces it through the communication traffic, through the specific language used in internal decision-making discussions that were captured through various intelligence means, and shows that in 11 of the 12 situations, the deciding factor was not a specific fear of Earth's direct military response. It was something subtler. It was the recognition that the political cost of aggressive action had increased, that the Galactic Congress's amended charter created a mechanism through which aggressive action would be formally documented and responded to, that the community of species who would witness and respond to aggressive action had grown to include parties who were now actively committed to response, rather than passive in their acknowledgement of harm, that the isolation that had previously allowed aggressive entities to act without significant consequence had become less reliable. The world, in other words, had gotten harder to be casually terrible in. Not impossible. Not so hard that every bad actor had simply stopped. There were still things happening in this galaxy that should not be happening, and we were working on them with the consistent, difficult, imperfect commitment of people who know the work is never finished, and do it anyway. But the baseline had shifted. The floor of what was considered acceptable behavior without consequence had risen. 14 months of work at the Congress, 11 charter amendments, 14 new member species, 4 active responses, 6 deployments, 17 bilateral agreements, and the slow accumulation of 1,000 smaller things that do not appear in any summary, but exist in the changed texture of the situations they influenced. The floor had risen. I sat with that for a long time. Nadia Lowe left the Unbroken Will 8 months ago. Her 3-year tour ended, and she had the option to extend, and she thought about it seriously, which I know because she came to my quarters one evening and talked about it with the honest, direct quality that she had always brought to everything she did. She decided not to extend. She had been offered a communications lead role at a new station near Earth, one that would give her a fixed location and regular hours, and the ability to spend time with her family, which she had been separated from for 3 years, and which she missed in ways she did not describe in detail, but which were apparent in the particular quality of her voice when she mentioned them. I told her that the decision was right, and that the Unbroken Will was better for having had her, and that wherever she went next would be better for having her. She thanked me, in the direct way she did everything, and then she said something that I have thought about many times since. "Commander," she said, and then stopped and started again. "Yara, when I first joined this crew, I knew what the mission was in terms of what it was, but I didn't know what it felt like from the inside. What it's like to be the person actually doing it, day to day, in the room where the specific decisions get made." I waited. "Now I know," she said. "And I think the most important thing I learned is something I didn't expect." "What is it?" I said. "It's that the people doing this work are completely ordinary," she said. "Not in a diminishing way. I mean that the qualities required are not superhuman. They are very human. They are just the ordinary human qualities, the ones that most people have some of, taken seriously and practiced consistently." She paused. "Fear of failing the people behind you, rather than fear of the enemy in front of you. Completing the mission rather than defeating the enemy. Showing up even when it's hard. Being honest, even when something easier would serve you better in the short term." She looked at me. "These are not special things. They are just things. The work is to do them seriously, consistently, every day, for a very long time. That's what I learned." I thought about whether she was right. I thought about it carefully, because it mattered. "I think you're right," I said. "And I think that might be the most important thing that could be understood about this work by someone outside it." She nodded. "I'll remember it," she said, "wherever I go." After she left, I sat with what she had said for a long time. The ordinary qualities, taken seriously and practiced consistently. The idea that what happened at Helix 9, and what had followed from it, was not the product of something exceptional in the people who carried it out, but of something ordinary, practiced, committed. I have been thinking about that ever since. 3 years after Helix 9, I sit in the observation bay of the Unbroken Will, when the ship is docked at the Congress station, and I look out at the stars, and I think about what it means to have arrived at a galaxy as a young civilization with 10,000 years of history packed into your culture like compressed energy, and to have found a community of other civilizations who had developed, over long periods of time, ways of being that had not required them to face the specific crucible that shaped humanity, and to have recognized that the things that crucible had produced in us, the seriousness, the preparation, the willingness to go directly to the hardest place in a situation rather than around it, were not embarrassing accidents of history, but genuine contributions we could make. We did not come to the stars to be the galaxy's most powerful entity. We came because that is what we do. We explore, we build, we connect. We carry the weight of what we have learned, including the parts that are heavy and the parts that are painful, and we do not set it down because it is inconvenient or because someone suggests it is unnecessary. The weight is not unnecessary. The weight is what keeps us honest about what we are doing and why. 14 months ago, I visited the memorial that Earth had built for the 4,200. It is in the capital city, accessible to anyone, open every day. The names are on the wall in the order of the station's residential registry, which was the way Cole Harrington asked for them to be arranged, not alphabetically, not by rank or age or anything else, but in the order they had lived, the order of their neighbors and their communities, grouped the way people actually live, rather than the way records categorize them. I walked the length of the wall. I read every name. It took a long time. In the section for the hydroponic level of the lower ring, I found George Albright's name. His daughter Mia had left a small drawing there, clipped to the wall in the way that visitors leave small things at memorials when they want to bring something of themselves to the person they are thinking about. The drawing was of a plant, a tall plant with broad leaves, drawn in the strong, decisive lines of a child who was confident in what she was trying to show. Under the plant, in careful handwriting, she had written 4 words. Still growing, still growing. I stood there for a while. Then I went back to work. That is the whole of the story I have to tell. Not the ending, because it does not have one yet. The work is ongoing. The world is still being made. The things that were planted at Helix 9 are still reaching upward, through conditions that were not designed for them, and finding the light anyway. But that is the part I was there for, and the part I know, and the part I can give you accurately. The rest is what comes next. And what comes next, as always, is the work. I should tell you about the message I received from Vrethok, because I have left it until now, and it belongs here at the end, rather than in the middle. It came 14 months after Helix 9, through an intermediary in the Sovereignty's diplomatic office, routed through the standard interspecies communication network, in a way that made clear it was intended to reach me personally, rather than Earth's government. The intermediary identified it as a private communication from the Admiral, and noted that no response was expected or required. Vrethok wrote it in his own language, and had it translated professionally, which I know, because the translation bears the marks of someone who took pains with the rendering, rather than simply converting words. Some things in it do not translate with full precision, and the translator had added small notes where the original meaning was richer than the English equivalent allowed. He did not open with pleasantries. He had the directness of a person who has never seen the point of them. He wrote, "Commander Vasquez, I am writing this because I believe it is honest to do so, and because I have learned, in the period following our encounter, that honesty about significant events is more useful than silence, even when honesty is uncomfortable." He wrote, "I gave the order to begin the action at Helix 9. I made that decision based on a strategic assessment that proved to be wrong in its most fundamental assumptions. I do not refer to the assumption about your capabilities, which was also wrong, but which is the kind of error that is correctable through better intelligence. I refer to the assumption about what the cost of such an action would be, measured not in your military response, which I did not anticipate correctly, but in what it would do to the Sovereignty's position in the broader galactic community, to our relationships with species who had previously trusted us, or at least tolerated us, and to what I am told by our historians is a record that will be read for a very long time." He wrote, "I am told that the Congress has passed amendments to its charter as a direct result of what occurred at Helix 9 and its aftermath. I am told that 14 new species have been admitted to membership. I am told that the Active Response Division was created in part because your testimony before the Congress body made its creation politically possible. I am told that 17 species have entered bilateral security arrangements with Earth." He paused in the letter, and the pause was visible in the structure of the writing. He wrote, "I am not telling you these things because I believe you are unaware of them. I am telling you because I want you to understand that I am aware of them, that I know the full extent of what my decision at Helix 9 set in motion, not just the direct military consequences, which were significant, but the cascade of consequences that continued outward from that engagement for 2 years, and shows no sign of stopping." Another pause. "You told me on the channel that humanity does not bargain with people who do what I did. I understood this to be a statement about negotiation. I understand it differently now. It is a statement about accountability. It is a statement that actions of the kind I took do not become acceptable because time passes or circumstances change, that they remain in the record and they shape what comes after them, and that the people who committed them carry that." He wrote, "I carry what I did at Helix 9. This is appropriate, and I do not complain of it. I write to you because I believe you carry it too, in the specific way that the person who responded to it carries a weight alongside the person who caused the need for the response. I thought you should know that I am aware of that weight, and that I consider it significant." The letter ended there. I read it several times. Then I thought about whether to respond, and I decided that I would, and I spent 2 days working out what to say before I wrote it. I said, "Admiral Vrethok, I received your letter, and I have considered it carefully. I want to respond honestly." I said, "You are correct, that I carry a weight alongside the weight you carry. You are also correct, that this is appropriate." The 4,200 who were lost at Helix 9 are in the record, and they are also in my memory, and they will remain there for the rest of my life. That is as it should be. I said, I want to tell you something that I have told very few people, because I think you have earned the honesty of it. When I arrived at Helix 9 with one warship in front of 50, I was afraid. Not of your fleet. Afraid of the possibility that I would make a mistake that would cost the 8,000 people in that station who were still alive. That fear was the most useful thing I carried into that situation. I believe it is also the thing that made the difference between an engagement that ended the way it did and one that ended worse for everyone. I said, the sovereignty has been quieter in the past year than in any of the preceding 12 years of your fleet command. I do not know whether that is a strategic recalibration or a temporary change while capability gaps are addressed, or something else entirely. But I notice it, and I believe it is significant, and I want you to know that I notice it. I said, the goal I have is not a galaxy in which the Tsar sovereignty is diminished. The goal is a galaxy in which the specific kind of action that occurred at Helix 9 does not occur. Those are different goals, and one of them is achievable, and it is the one I am working toward. I thought you should know that too. I sent it, through the same intermediary, back to him. He did not respond. But 6 months later, the Sovereignty's fleet withdrew from a contested zone where their presence had been creating pressure for a smaller species, and no statement was made. No formal announcement, no public explanation. They simply withdrew. Owen, monitoring the traffic, noted it in his weekly summary with characteristic brevity. Sovereignty fleet withdrawal from the Pelman contested zone. No stated reason. Consistent with reduced risk tolerance in areas of potential conflict with human-affiliated interests. Worth watching. Worth watching. I watched. I watch still. There are days when the work feels like it amounts to something clear, when the framework agreement gets signed, or the charter amendment passes, or a situation resolves without the force that would have been required a year ago. On those days, the weight feels like it is being carried toward something, and the carrying has a purpose that is visible and direct. There are other days when the work is only the work, the meetings and the assessments and the communication traffic and the careful maintenance of a presence in places that need it. The tomatoes grow. Owen sends his summaries. I read everything that comes through my office, and respond to what requires a response, and make the decisions that are mine to make, and refer the ones that belong to someone else. On both kinds of days, I carry the same things. The 4,200. The 8,000 who came home. Mia Albright's drawing on the memorial wall. Nadia Lowe's observation about ordinary qualities. Cole Harrington saying thank you, in a loop into open space. Vrethok's hands trembling slightly in the screen when he finally understood what he had encountered. I carry all of it. And I come to work in the morning. That is what there is to say. One last thing, because I think it matters. A new crew member joined the Unbroken Wills communications team 4 months ago. Her name is Alice Park. She is 23 years old, 6 months out of the Fleet Communications Academy, and she is very good at her job in the way that people are good at things they were made for, and have put real effort into. On her 3rd week, she asked me a question that I did not expect. She had been reviewing the Helix 9 records as part of her orientation, the full records, the sensor data and the communications logs, and the tactical breakdown, and the transcript of the fleet-wide broadcast. She had been doing this on her own time, not as a required part of her onboarding, but because she wanted to understand what she was joining. She came to my office in the morning before her shift started and knocked on the door frame, and when I told her to come in, she stood in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides. Not exactly the way Owen does it, but with the same quality of someone who is being careful about what they are about to say. Commander Vasquez, she said, may I ask you something about Helix 9? Yes, I said. When you pressed the broadcast button, she said, and opened the channel to 50 enemy ships, before you spoke. In the moment before you opened your mouth. What were you thinking? I looked at her for a moment. She was young, and she was paying very close attention, and she had a quality in her expression that I recognized as the quality of someone who was trying to understand something real, not just gather information. I thought about the answer carefully, because she deserved the careful version. I was thinking about the 8,000 people in the station, I said. I was thinking about the specific weight of being the only thing between them and what happened to the 4,200. I was thinking that I had better not waste the moment. I paused, and I was thinking that whatever I said needed to be true. Exactly and completely true, with nothing in it that I could not stand behind completely. Because the moment you say something in a situation like that which is not exactly true, the whole structure of it becomes uncertain. She nodded slowly. And the 7 words, she said. You killed our people. We remember everything. Did you plan those specifically? Or did they come to you in the moment? I planned them, I said. For a long time. How long? I thought about it honestly. Since the first time I read an intelligence report about what the Tsar sovereignty called administrative correction, I said, which was about 2 years before Helix 9. I didn't know where or when I would need them, but I knew what the essential truth was that needed to be said clearly, and so I carried it, and when the moment came, they were ready. She looked at me steadily. Is that how it always works? She said. You carry the essential truth until you need it? I thought about Nadia Lowe's observation about ordinary qualities, taken seriously and practiced consistently. I thought about the weight that is not a burden but a compass. I thought about the morning after Helix 9, when I woke up, and thought not about what had happened, but about what came next. Yes, I said. That is how it works. She nodded. She said, Thank you, Commander. She went to her shift. I went to mine. The tomatoes are growing well this week. The conditions are still not designed for them. They grow anyway. So do we.